Hey adventurer, welcome back to The Weary Wanderer. This time, we're strapping on our hobnailed sandals to trudge, or rather, be relentlessly herded through the breathtakingly hostile Alps and onwards into the wild, damp, and generally unwelcoming frontiers of Britannia. Get ready to discover in painstaking, uncomfortable detail just how comprehensively life sucked for the Roman legionary on the march. It was an experience less about the propagandized glory you see on triumphal arches, and far more about a slow, grinding, and deeply personal attrition of body, mind, and spirit, a masterclass in sustained suffering for the sake of an empire that likely didn't know or care about his individual name. You've seen them, haven't you? In the grand imperial friezes, all rippling musculature and noble profiles, marching in perfect, indomitable lockstep. Perhaps your image is forged by heroic, albeit wildly inaccurate, Hollywood epics. The Roman legionary, breastplates polished to a mirror shine by an army of imaginary servants, cloaks a dashing shade of Pompeian red, always ready with a stoic jawline and a pithy Latin phrase as they carve civilization, one violated treaty at a time, out of the barbarian wilderness. They project power, unwavering order, and a certain rugged martial glamour that has captivated imaginations for 2 millennia. They are the very symbol of disciplined might, the iron fist of Rome, the architects of an empire that once spanned the known world. But let's be brutally honest, as we always are here on The Weary Wanderer. Being a real Roman legionary, one of the poor sods like our soon-to-be introduced Gaius, particularly one tasked with slogging his way over the frozen, treacherous, oxygen-starved spine of the Alps, and then plunging into the mist-shrouded, perpetually damp, and deeply hostile uncertainties of Britannia, was nothing like those sanitized stone carvings or the technicolor fantasies of the silver screen. It was a masterclass in prolonged, multifaceted, and often deeply inventive suffering. It was punishingly hard physical labor, far exceeding any modern concept of a tough workout. It was soul-crushingly repetitive, a daily cycle of march, dig, endure that would make Sisyphus himself apply for a transfer. It was disease-ridden, with threats lurking in every mouthful of water and every shared breath in a cramped tent. It was, at unpredictable intervals, terrifyingly violent. And yet, for vast stretches, it was characterized by a mind-numbing, soul-corroding boredom, punctuated only by fear and misery. For the vast majority who lived it, trudging day in and day out, year after weary year, it profoundly sucked. Forget the gleaming armor. Picture instead the relentless chafing of ill-fitting leather straps against sweat-soaked wool, the caked-on layers of grime and mud that became a second skin, and the ever-present, inescapable stench of too many unwashed men, stale fear, cheap sour wine, and the faint, disturbing metallic tang of old blood. Now that's not to say there weren't fleeting moments of something other than pure, unadulterated misery. Imagine, if you can, cresting a high alpine pass after days of brutal climbing, the air thin and sharp as broken glass, and seeing the world spread out beneath you like a crumpled map. A vista of terrifying, inhuman grandeur that might, for a heartbeat, make you forget the burning in your lungs and the frostbite nipping at your toes, or the grim, almost violent satisfaction of seeing a perfectly square, deeply ditched, and fiercely palisaded marching camp rise out of a hostile wilderness in a matter of hours, a testament to Roman engineering and sheer bloody-mindedness. There was the rough, often brutal camaraderie forged in the crucible of shared hardship, the bark of laughter at a joke so dark it would make Hades himself chuckle. And sometimes, even the bizarre alien beauty of a new, untamed landscape could evoke a sense of awe, or perhaps just stunned disbelief at the sheer variety of places Rome expected you to go and suffer in. These flickers of something other than pain certainly existed, but they were mere pinpricks of fractured light in a vast, oppressive Stygian darkness of daily toil, constant discomfort, and ever-present peril, serving mostly, if we're honest, to make the inevitable return to the grind that much more bitter, a cruel reminder of what life wasn't. So, If you're ready to delve into the authentic, uncomfortable, and often frankly appalling reality behind the legend, to strip away the marble and the myth, and get down to the blood, sweat, and tears, do take a moment to like this video and subscribe to The Weary Wanderer. We're building a community here of folks who appreciate history with its calluses, its scars, and its occasionally terrible BO fully intact. And please, let me know in the comments below. What's the first thing that comes to your mind when you picture a Roman soldier on the march? What's the movie scene? The painting? The phrase? I'm genuinely curious to hear your preconceptions before we systematically, and with a certain grim relish, dismantle them. Now, find a comfortable spot, a true, almost unimaginable luxury our legionary, whom we shall call Gaius, rarely, if ever, knew in his 25 years of service. Perhaps pour yourself a civilized drink, something that doesn't taste faintly of rust and regret, unlike the sour posca that would be his daily, unappetizing ration. Close your eyes for a moment, if you will, and prepare to take your place in the ranks. Feel the biting alpine wind trying to peel the skin from your face, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and refuses to leave. Hear the rhythmic, monotonous, soul-deadening crunch of thousands upon thousands of hobnailed caligae on unforgiving stone, a sound that will become the soundtrack to your existence. Smell the... well, as I said, we'll get to the smells. There are so many smells. Let's march. So, how does one find oneself volunteered for this grand imperial enterprise, this extended walking tour of other people's countries with intermittent stabbing? Did young Gaius, our archetypal sufferer, gaze upon the gleaming eagles from the dilapidated doorstep of his rustic farmhouse, his heart swelling with an irresistible tide of patriotic fervor, dreaming of glory, honor, and the sacred duty of expanding Roman virtue to the less enlightened, and usually less heavily armed, corners of the world? For Gaius, and for countless legions of lads like him scraped from the rural underbelly of the empire, you weren't so much born with a silver gladius lovingly tucked into your hand, as you were inexorably funneled towards the recruiting grounds by the unyielding, grinding contours of poverty, lack of opportunity, and the occasional famine. He was likely a farmer's son, perhaps from some sun-baked, dusty, fly-blown plot in southern Italy where the olive trees were as tired as the soil, or maybe from a slightly more rustic and recently pacified corner of Gaul or Hispania, where the local gods were plentiful and vengeful, but the harvests were frequently less so, and Roman tax collectors were a new and unwelcome addition to the landscape. No sprawling vineyards tended by armies of contented slaves, no vast fields of waving wheat awaited his inheritance. Just the family's exhausted, over-mortgaged patch of dirt, a legacy of dawn to dusk, back-breaking toil under a merciless sun, and the ever-present, all-pervading scent of goat, desperation, mildew, and perhaps a charming hint of the open sewer that ran through the village, practically woven into the rough-spun fabric of his swaddling cloth from the moment of his birth. He was, in essence, pre-marinated in hardship. The choice to join the legions, when the dilectator, the recruiting officer, swaggered into the dusty village square, was often no real choice at all. He'd speak of adventure in exotic lands, neglecting to mention the exotic diseases, of camaraderie and brotherhood, omitting the part about your bunkmate stealing your last piece of hardtack, of steady pay, and the emperor's gratitude, without detailing the endless deductions or the emperor's geographical and emotional distance. He might promise enlistment bonuses, a few shiny coins to press into a mother's hand, a way to escape the crushing debt that hung over the family like a permanent rain cloud. For a young man facing a future of being just another hungry mouth on an overburdened farm, the army represented a gamble, a desperate throw of the dice against a life of predictable, attritional poverty and the slow starvation of hope. Sure, the army offered 25 years of brutal hardship, the constant threat of violent death, and a very high probability of chronic illness, but it also offered something tangible, steady pay, such as it was after the centurion had taken his cut for wine rations, and the quartermaster had adjusted for spoilage. The possibility of a discharge bonus, a plot of land, perhaps ironically in some newly pacified, still smoldering hellhole you yourself had helped conquer, miles from anywhere you knew, or a lump sum of coin that sounded like a king's ransom to a lad whose family counted their entire net worth in a handful of scrawny chickens and a collection of leaky pottery amphorae. For provincials, those born outside Italy without the coveted rights of a Roman, service in the legions, or more often the auxiliary units that fought alongside them, could even mean the ultimate prize upon discharge: full Roman citizenship for himself and his descendants. A golden ticket in a deeply stratified and often xenophobic world. So, Gaius, probably around 18 or 20 years old, his body hardened by years of wrestling with stubborn mules and unforgiving rocky soil, but with a future that looked as barren and uninviting as a salt flat after a particularly enthusiastic salting, would have stepped forward. He'd take the sacramentum, the sacred oath, swearing allegiance to the emperor and the standards, to obey his commanders without question, and not to desert, even unto death. Perhaps there was a fleeting flicker of youthful excitement in that moment, the primal lure of escaping the suffocating smallness of his village, the siren song of seeing the world, even if that world was mostly going to be viewed through a haze of exhaustion, mud, and the occasional arrow. This tiny, almost imperceptible positive spark would soon be systematically ground into the dust by the hobnailed marching boots of grim reality. But it might have been there. A brief, defiant candle flame before the inevitable hurricane of legionary life. His early training for the Legion, the conditioning that made him suitable material, wasn't conducted in pristine, custom-built training facilities with patient, encouraging instructors keen on positive reinforcement. Oh no. Life itself had been his drill sergeant from infancy, and it was a particularly uninspired, brutal, and unimaginative one. From the moment young Gaius could toddle without immediately face-planting into the goat dung that carpeted the yard, he was put to work. Forget childhood. That was a luxury for the sons of senators. By age 6, he was cheap, expendable labor, his tiny, chapped hands performing tasks that would make a modern child protection officer spontaneously combust into a shower of pamphlets and righteous indignation, while other, more fortunate children in distant, decadent Rome were perhaps learning their letters from a Greek slave or playing with finely crafted ivory dolls and miniature chariots. Gaius was mastering the grim practical skills essential for survival in a world that didn't care much if he did, and in fact, often seemed actively hostile to the prospect. His toys? A worn-out, rust-pitted wooden sickle his father grudgingly let him use to cut fodder for the family's single, mournful-looking donkey if he promised not to sever any major arteries. A collection of smooth river stones, carefully selected for their aerodynamic properties, perfect for stunning a stray pigeon, or, if he was exceptionally lucky and fleet of foot, a witless rabbit, protein, or maybe just a particularly interesting, sturdy stick that could, with enough squinting and a fertile imagination, become a gladius to fend off the imaginary wolves, or more pressingly, the very real village bully, in the shadowy depths of the local olive grove. He learned to endure blistering summer heat that shimmered off the parched earth and bone-chilling winter winds that whistled through the cracks in their hovel with a stoic, almost bovine resignation. He learned how to make a meager meal of coarse bread and a few wilted greens last an entire day. He learned how to read the subtle signs of the weather, badly at first, leading to many a thorough drenching and his father's colorful curses. He learned to navigate by the position of the sun and the patterns of the stars, not for any romantic or philosophical reason, but simply to find his way back to his miserable home after being sent on some pointless, time-consuming errand in the encroaching dark. This wasn't character building in the noble Plutarchian sense. It was the slow, grinding accumulation of physical and mental calluses, a premature weathering that would perversely make him ideal legionary material. He was being conditioned, from his first breath, to accept misery, discomfort, and arbitrary hardship as the default, unchangeable state of human existence. His primary instructor in this unforgiving open-air school of hard knocks was likely his father, a man whose face was a veritable roadmap of failed harvests, crushing debts, and simmering unspoken frustrations. Etched with the deep lines of ceaseless worry and weathered by too many seasons under a cruel and indifferent sun, his father's expression rarely softened. His vocabulary was as sparse and unyielding as their winter stores, consisting mainly of guttural grunts, sharp monosyllabic commands, and the occasional creatively despairing curse directed at the gods, the weather, a disobedient animal, or most frequently, his own unfortunate offspring. He taught Gaius everything not through patient explanation or gentle encouragement, but through harsh example, the example of endless, uncomplaining, or, depending on his mood and wine intake, very loudly and profanely complaining, toil, and the occasional stinging clout to the side of the head if an instruction wasn't followed with sufficient alacrity and an appropriately subservient expression. Or perhaps there was a grizzled old veteran limping around the village, an Uncle Lucius or some such character, missing a few fingers from some long-forgotten skirmish in Germania, and with a hacking cough that sounded like rocks rattling in a rusty barrel. He'd sit in the thin winter sun outside the local wine shop, if the village was grand enough to possess one, occasionally dispensing nuggets of cynical, world-weary wisdom between sips of heavily watered-down, vinegary wine. His stories of military service weren't the gleaming sagas of heroism and glory peddled by the recruiters. They were tales of endless, mind-numbing marching, of food so bad it would make a goat vomit, of terrifying chaotic ambushes in dark, dripping forests, and of the sheer, bloody, agonizing pointlessness of much of it all. He'd speak of corrupt centurions, incompetent officers, and the pervasive, ever-present threat of disease that killed more men than barbarian spears. Yet, paradoxically, his very survival, his possession of a few worn discharge coins that he'd jingle in his pouch, and the slightly less dilapidated hovel those coins afforded him, made him an embodiment of the only viable escape route Gaius could perceive from the suffocating trap of village life. Lucius wouldn't have encouraged him with stirring tales of heroism or patriotic duty, but with brutally practical, unvarnished advice. Keep your head down, your mouth shut, your kit clean, and for Jupiter's sake, boy, learn to sleep standing up. It'll save you a world of trouble. And never volunteer for anything, especially not for the first watch or anything involving boats. This grim, unromantic counsel, more than any heroic ballad or imperial decree, might have been the final decisive nudge. He wasn't aspiring to be a hero. He was aspiring, quite simply, to be a survivor, like Lucius, albeit hopefully with more fingers and less of a death rattle cough. So Gaius, our freshly minted legionary, has traded the pastoral, if soul-destroying monotony of the farm for the dynamic, exciting, and gloriously uncertain life of a Roman soldier on campaign. Except, dynamic and exciting are words typically employed by poets lounging in comfortable mosaic-floored villas far from the front lines, not by men like Gaius, currently hauling 60 to 80 pounds of assorted ironmongery, leather, and personal regret up a ridiculously steep mountain in a developing blizzard. His new life, he would rapidly discover, was defined by a grind so relentless, so utterly consuming, it made his old farm chores look like a leisurely aristocratic pastime. Holidays, paid annual leave, weekends off for a bit of light pillaging and personal reflection. These were adorable, almost mythical concepts, as common for a Roman legionary on active campaign as a heartfelt apology from a tax collector or a genuinely altruistic senator. The glory of Rome, it turned out, didn't build itself on a 5-day work week, and the Alps certainly weren't going to politely flatten themselves out of deference to tired feet. The road to Britannia, Gaius was beginning to understand, was paved not with good intentions, but with sweat, calluses, broken teeth, and the rapidly shattering illusions of countless recruits just like him. A typical day, if such a reliably awful thing could be said to exist in the varied smorgasbord of hellscapes that constituted a long campaign, began well before the sun god Saul even considered nudging his fiery chariot over the eastern horizon. A trumpet blast sharp, discordant, and loud enough to pierce the thickest wine-induced fog still clinging to your skull from the previous night's meager ration would signal the official start of another glorious 24 hours in selfless service to the emperor and the abstract concept of Roman destiny. Breakfast, if you could dignify the morning ritual with such a term, was usually a dense, palm-sized hunk of hardtack, which often had to be soaked in water or pasca to be rendered even vaguely chewable. This culinary delight was washed down with a hearty swig of said pasca, that delightful all-purpose concoction of sour wine or vinegar heavily diluted with water. Sometimes it was water with faint aspirations of becoming wine. Sometimes it was vinegar that had clearly given up on life and embraced its destiny as a disinfectant. Nutritious, delicious, and just the thing to put a spring in your step as you prepared for the next 8 to 10 hours of brutal, uncomplaining, outwardly at least, marching. Then it was straight to the cherished ritual of packing your sarsina, your personal pack, a heavy, awkward bundle of everything deemed essential for your survival and operational effectiveness. This included your spare clothing, which usually consisted of a couple of threadbare tunics and some rags of indeterminate origin, your bedding, a thin woolen cloak that doubled as a blanket and in a pinch a shroud, your personal cooking pot, shared with 7 other equally fragrant individuals, a small hand axe, and your entrenching tools, and a wicker basket for the endless task of moving earth. Add to this several days' rations of grain, adding considerably to the weight, your personal eating utensils, if you hadn't lost them or had them stolen yet, and any tiny personal trinkets that hadn't yet been lost, stolen, or bartered for a moment's solace or an extra mouthful of food. All this, remember, was in addition to your armor, the lorica segmentata with its myriad straps and buckles, or the heavier, more flexible lorica hamata mail shirt, your helmet, galea, your large, unwieldy shield, scutum, your trusty short sword, gladius, your dagger, pugio, and the 2 heavy 7-foot-long javelins, pila, that were your primary ranged weapon. Fully loaded for a day's march, Gaius was less a soldier and more a walking beast of burden, a mobile argument against the very concept of personal comfort, a human snail carrying his entire miserable world on his protesting back. Each item had to be stowed just so, or the centurion would have something loud and unpleasant to say about it, usually accompanied by a painful demonstration with his vine staff. The march itself was a masterclass in disciplined, mind-numbing monotony. Mile after agonizing, identical mile, in tightly packed columns of 8 abreast, often in stifling, dust-choked heat that turned your helmet into a personal oven, or in freezing, wind-driven rain that seeped into every stitch of clothing and chilled you to the bone. The centurion, a man whose general disposition suggested he'd been personally slighted by the invention of joy, and whose face looked like it had been carved from a particularly unyielding piece of granite, would be there, lurking on the flanks of the column or marching at its head. His ever-present vine staff was always ready to encourage any slackers, stragglers, or anyone who looked like they might be enjoying themselves even fractionally. The pace was grueling, a steady, relentless rhythm designed to cover ground with brutal efficiency, not with any consideration for human comfort or joint health. 15, 20, sometimes even 25 Roman miles a day, that's about 14 to 23 modern miles, or 22 to 37 kilometers, if the terrain was forgiving, and the officers were feeling particularly ambitious, sadistic, or were simply in a hurry to get somewhere else to be miserable. Through the jagged foothills and high passes of the Alps, this meant steep, lung-burning ascents that left your calves screaming in protest and your vision swimming, followed by treacherous, knee-jarring descents, where a single misstep on loose scree or an icy patch could send you tumbling into a ravine, much to the temporary, if callous, amusement of your comrades, who would then have to retrieve your gear. Meaningful breaks? Those, it seemed, were a luxury reserved for the enemy, or perhaps for the generals comfortably reviewing maps miles behind the lines. You ate when and where you could, often on the move, gnawing on your flint-hard hardtack like a particularly despondent rodent, or scooping handfuls of cold porridge from your pot during the briefest of halts. The only real variation in the relentless marching routine came when the column encountered an obstacle. Then, you might be ordered to clear a path through dense forest, fell ancient trees with your inadequate hand axes, to construct a makeshift bridge over a swollen river, or conduct other engineering works, which was Roman military speak for even more backbreaking labor, but this time with shovels and pickaxes instead of just walking. This could involve anything from building a corduroy road across a treacherous bog to dislodging boulders from a narrow mountain pass. And the glorious culmination of this delightful day of toil and torment, arriving at the designated stopping point, often as a gray, unforgiving dusk began to settle and the temperature started to plummet, not for a well-deserved hot meal and a comfortable bed. Oh no. Now came the truly inspiring character-building part of the schedule, the construction of a fortified marching camp. Every single damned night. Unless you were deep within territory so thoroughly Romanized, pacified, and generally cowed that it was practically serving tea and biscuits to passing legions, which was decidedly not the case in the Alps or pre-invasion Britannia, you built a fortress from scratch. This wasn't a casual affair of leaning a few shields together and hoping for the best. This was a highly organized, ruthlessly efficient, and utterly exhausting undertaking. This meant each man digging his allotted section of a defensive ditch, usually 9 to 12 feet wide and 7 to 9 feet deep, a task made infinitely more challenging by rocky soil, tree roots, or frozen ground. It meant using the excavated earth to throw up an equally substantial earthen rampart behind the ditch. And then, it meant topping that rampart with a sturdy palisade of sharpened wooden stakes, 2 of which each legionary carried as part of his standard kit, in addition to everything else. All of this, remember, after a full day's march under a crushing load, in failing light, with muscles screaming in protest and stomachs rumbling with hunger. It was a miracle of Roman engineering, a testament to their discipline and the legionaries' incredible endurance, yes, but for Gaius, sweating and straining in the deepening gloom, it was just another hour or 2 of agonizing, thankless toil before he could finally collapse onto the hard ground of his tent. And yet, there was a strange, almost terrifying beauty to it all. If you could somehow detach your mind from the immediate, overwhelming sensations of suffering for a fleeting nanosecond, to witness tens of thousands of men, moving with a unified, relentless, almost ant-like purpose, transforming a wild, hostile landscape into an ordered, secure, and geometrically perfect fortified camp in a matter of mere hours. It was an undeniably awesome display of human organization, discipline, and raw power. The legionary standards, the eagles and cohort emblems, catching the last defiant rays of the setting sun as they were planted firmly within the new ramparts. The rhythmic percussive thud of hundreds of mallets driving home the palisade stakes. The sheer, overwhelming scale of the enterprise unfurling across the darkening land. It could, if you were in a particularly philosophical or delirious mood, stir a flicker of something akin to pride, or at least a profound, unsettling sense of being part of something immense, terrifying, and utterly unstoppable, however brutal its methods. It was the kind of spectacle that probably made local tribesmen, observing from a safe distance on a wooded hilltop, simultaneously incandescent with fury and deeply, deeply concerned for their future property values and life expectancy. The Alps, in particular, weren't so much a picturesque mountain range, a painter's idyllic backdrop, as they were a malevolent, frost-toothed, actively hostile deity that seemed personally offended by your legion's attempt to cross them. The air grew thin and bitingly cold, each breath a painful rasp in your burning lungs, the lack of oxygen making even simple tasks feel like Herculean efforts. The paths, when they existed at all, narrowed to treacherous, windswept ledges, barely wide enough for a single man, where one misplaced step, one sudden gust of wind catching your shield, meant a quick, messy, and very final meeting with the jagged rocks hundreds of feet below. Sudden, localized blizzards could sweep in with terrifying speed, reducing visibility to mere feet, blinding you with swirling snow, freezing your extremities numb, and turning the already difficult terrain into an icy, potentially lethal death trap. Snow blindness, a searing pain behind the eyes, became a real and debilitating threat, as did frostbite, which had a nasty, insidious habit of claiming unprotected fingers, toes, ears, and noses as unsolicited permanent souvenirs of your alpine adventure. Glare ice, hidden beneath a deceptive dusting of fresh snow, could send entire files of men skittering and crashing. Rivers swollen and roaring with glacial snowmelt were icy, fast-flowing torrents that had to be forded or laboriously bridged, often while hostile mountain-dwelling tribesmen, who knew this treacherous terrain like the back of their unwashed hands, took opportunistic and highly irritating potshots with slings and arrows from the seemingly inaccessible cliffs above. Avalanches, triggered by a sudden thaw, or simply the mountain's capricious whim, were another charming feature, capable of obliterating entire sections of the path, and any unfortunate legionaries on it, in a thunderous, suffocating wave of snow and rock. And the sun, oh, the glorious, life-giving sun. In the lower valleys, before the serious climbing began, it could be a celestial blacksmith's forge, beating down mercilessly, reflecting off your polished helmet and armor until your brain felt like it was slowly poaching inside your skull. Combined with the relentless physical exertion, heatstroke was a constant lurking companion, ready to fell the unwary or the unlucky. Then, as you ascended into the higher altitudes, the sun would often vanish, replaced by a sky that was either a vast, indifferent, soul-sapping gray, or actively, malevolently, hurling ice, sleet, and misery down upon your exposed head. The wind, that ubiquitous feature of mountain landscapes, wasn't a refreshing, cooling breeze. In the lowlands, it could be a hot, sandy, suffocating exhalation from the lungs of some desert demon, carrying dust that gritted in your teeth and stung your eyes. Higher up, it transformed into an icy, razor-sharp blast, funneled through narrow mountain passes with gale force, seemingly designed by a cruel god to flay the skin from your bones, steal the very breath from your lungs, and extinguish any lingering spark of warmth or hope. Even the trees seemed hostile, their gnarled roots hidden beneath leaves or snow, perfectly placed to trip you, their low-slung branches snagging your gear and threatening to take an eye out. And once Gaius and his legion eventually stumbled out of the alpine nightmare and into the rolling, often sodden landscapes of northern Gaul, en route to the coast and the eventual horrors of Britannia, the environment merely shifted its mode of attack. Now it was endless, damp, primeval forests, where ambushes lurked around every bend. Chilling, impenetrable fogs that could swallow entire cohorts, and treacherous bogs and marshes that could suck a heavily laden man down into their gurgling, fetid depths with horrifying speed. Each new environment simply offered its own unique and inventive palette of suffering, a fresh set of challenges designed to test the limits of human endurance, and often to find them wanting. Forget the gentle, lilting sounds of nature, the cheerful chirping of birds, or the uplifting strains of well-rehearsed martial music, which was usually reserved for triumphal parades back in Rome, not for soul-crushing marches through hostile territory. The predominant soundscape of Gaius's daily life was a relentless, grating, and deeply unsettling symphony of suffering. The constant, rhythmic, inescapable thump-thump creak jingle of thousands upon thousands of hobnailed caligae, those infamous military sandals, pounding relentlessly on rock, dirt, gravel, or sucking mud. The equally constant jingle-jangle clank of 80 pounds of assorted metalwork accompanying every single weary step, a cacophonous announcement of your miserable presence. The rhythmic thwack or clank of shield against scabbard or leg armor. the strained, painful grunts and muttered, often highly inventive, curses of your fellow legionaries as they stumbled, sweated, and suffered alongside you. The sharp, barking, often unintelligible commands of the centurions and optios, voices raw from shouting over the din. The distant, or sometimes alarmingly close, braying of pack mules, protesting their own equally miserable existence, a sound that somehow managed to embody pure, unadulterated despair. The mournful whine of the wind through desolate mountain passes, the relentless lash of rain against your helmet and cloak, the ominous, stomach-lurching rumble of a distant avalanche in the mountains, or the sudden, heart-stopping crack of a falling tree. And then there was the unsettling rustle in the dense undergrowth just beyond the edge of the path, a sound that could be a harmless woodland creature, a slithering snake, or, much worse, the prelude to a barbarian ambush. At night in the supposedly secure camp, it was the endless chorus of coughs, a symphony of bronchial distress, the varied and often truly apocalyptic snores of exhausted men crammed 8 to a tent, the quiet, measured pacing of the sentries on the ramparts, and the ever-present nerve-jangling possibility of a sudden night alarm, a blare of trumpets sending you scrambling for your weapons in the pitch dark. It was a constant grating, deeply unsettling cacophony that offered no peace, no respite, a soundtrack to a life lived perpetually on edge. Where to even begin with the litany of persistent physical miseries that defined Gaius's existence? The chafing. Oh gods, the eternal, inescapable chafing. Leather straps from his armor and pack digging mercilessly into his shoulders and groin, the coarse, lanolin-rich wool of his tunic rubbing his skin raw, especially when mixed with abrasive sweat, grime, and road dust. This could quickly lead to painful infected sores if not carefully, and impossibly given the conditions, managed. His feet, those poor, abused servants, were in a perpetual state of torment, alternating between being swollen, blistered, and bleeding from the relentless friction of the march inside his caliga, or numb, aching, and tinged an unhealthy blue from the biting cold and damp. Every single muscle group in his body would take its turn, or often, scream in unison, in protest, his back from the crushing weight of the Sarsina, his legs from the endless miles, his shoulders from the shield, his neck from the helmet. Sunburn with skin peeling off in painful sheets was common in exposed terrain. Windburn leaving his face feeling tight, cracked, and raw was a gift from the mountain passes. Frostnip, the insidious precursor to frostbite, would turn fingertips and earlobes a waxy, alarming white. Then there was the constant, maddening, itchy torment of lice, fleas, and other assorted biting vermin, which considered legionary camps and unwashed legionary bodies to be delightful, all-inclusive, 5-star resorts with an unlimited buffet. The gritty, pervasive film of dust that coated everything in dry weather was a constant irritant. And in wet weather, which was much of the time in northern Europe, it was the clinging, sodden, bone-deep chill of damp clothes that never, ever truly dried, a sensation that could leach the warmth and will to live out of a man. It was an existence lived in a state of perpetual, grinding, low-grade, and frequently escalating to very high-grade physical misery, a continuous assault on the body's ability to cope. The olfactory landscape for Gaius was an ode to misery, so potent it would make a hardened vulture retch and seek a cleaner profession. The primary, inescapable bass note was unwashed humanity. The stale, pungent, slightly sour aroma of thousands of sweating men who hadn't had the luxury of a proper bath in weeks, if not months, their bodies caked in layers of dried sweat, road dust, and general filth. This signature fragrance mingled harmoniously with the acrid, earthy tang of old, well-worn leather from straps and tents, the faint metallic scent of rusting iron from armor and weapons, and the damp, musty, almost gamey smell of woolen tunics and cloaks that were rarely, if ever, truly dry. Add to this heady bouquet the sharp, vinegary, slightly fermented scent of posca that seemed to cling to everyone's breath and person. Then there was the slightly sweet, cloying, sickly smell of wound dressings, festering sores, and infected blisters. Injuries were common, and field hygiene was rudimentary at best. The sharp, coppery metallic tang of blood was a frequent, if unwelcome, addition after any skirmish. The rich, earthy smell of newly dug fortifications, the damp soil of ramparts, and the pervasive, clinging aroma of wood smoke from countless small, inefficient campfires, burning whatever green or damp wood could be scavenged, which often produced more smoke than heat. And let's not forget the pièce de résistance, the latrines. These were usually just a series of designated trenches dug on the downwind side of the camp, and in a large, semi-permanent encampment housing thousands of men and animals, they would contribute a truly monumental, eye-watering, stomach-churning olfactory statement that could, on a warm day with a shifting wind, blanket the entire area in a miasma of concentrated human waste. Occasionally, very occasionally, the crisp, clean scent of pine in the high Alps, or the damp, loamy earth of an untouched forest, might offer a brief, deceptive, almost shocking respite before the overwhelming, multi-layered miasma of Roman military life reasserted its suffocating dominance. Every profession, from the noblest philosopher to the humblest ditch digger, has its tools. And for Gaius, the Roman legionary, these implements weren't just accessories to his trade. They were constant, unavoidable companions, simultaneously his burdens, his lifesavers, and, with a frequency that bordered on malicious intent, infuriating sources of additional, unnecessary torment. He was a walking arsenal, a mobile construction unit, a beast of burden laden with the instruments of imperial will. And every single piece of his meticulously issued kit, from the hobnails in his sandals to the crest on his helmet, if he was fancy enough to have one that wasn't just horsehair, seemed to possess its own problematic personality, usually a grumpy, uncooperative, and actively malevolent one. Let's begin our detailed inventory of suffering with his personal protective gear, his so-called iron skin, the armor that was supposed to keep his vital organs on the inside. The iconic lorica segmentata, those overlapping horizontal hoops and vertical curved plates of iron, fastened with an intricate and infuriating system of internal leather straps and bronze buckles, looked undeniably impressive. It shouted "Rome and don't mess with me," and offered theoretically decent protection against a barbarian's enthusiastic but generally unrefined swing, or a poorly aimed arrow. When all its myriad components were functioning correctly, that is. Which, under campaign conditions, was a rare and beautiful dream. Those leather straps, constantly exposed to sweat, rain, and stress, had a diabolical tendency to fray, stretch, stiffen, or snap at the most inconvenient and life-threatening moments, say halfway up a sheer alpine goat track, during a river crossing, or most charmingly, just as a large, hairy, blue-painted Briton with a very big sword was charging him with murderous intent. Rust was a constant, insidious enemy, especially in the damp, clinging climes of northern Gaul and Britannia. Each overlapping segment seemed to trap moisture like a miniature reservoir, and scrubbing it away every evening with sand, vinegar, or, if he was lucky, a little oil, was yet another delightful, time-consuming chore in a day already packed with them. Neglected, and your armor could seize up, or worse, rust through, offering all the protection of a particularly brittle biscuit. The alternative, for some legionaries, particularly in earlier periods or in certain legions, was the lorica hamada, a long shirt of riveted or welded iron mail. This was heavier than the segmentata, a clinking, flexible curtain of interlinked iron rings that offered good protection against slashing attacks, but did little to absorb the crushing, bone-shattering impact of a heavy club, a warhammer, or an axe. Meaning you could die from spectacular internal injuries, a ruptured spleen or shattered ribs, without a single visible scratch on your fancy mail shirt. It also had a charming habit of snagging on every available thorn bush, tree branch, or protruding piece of equipment, and if you were unfortunate enough to fall into water while wearing it, its weight would drag you to the bottom like an anchor tied to a particularly unlucky cat. His helmet, the galea, typically made of iron or bronze, was a masterpiece of cranial protection. Designed to deflect sword blows, absorb the impact of slingstones, and look suitably martial and intimidating with its flaring neck guard, hinged cheek pieces, and often a slot for a horsehair or feathered crest, though these were probably reserved more for parade than for slogging through a bog. It undoubtedly saved countless lives. It also effectively limited peripheral vision, meaning threats could approach from the sides unnoticed. It turned your head into a miniature oven under the blazing summer sun, trapping heat and sweat until your hair was plastered to your skull, and your brain felt like it was slowly poaching. In the bitter cold of an alpine winter or a Britannic night, the metal, separated from your skull by only a thin layer of padding, if you were lucky, felt like a personal ice pack sent by the god Pluto himself, radiating cold inwards. Hearing commands clearly, or more importantly, detecting the subtle, stealthy sound of an approaching enemy through a dense forest, could be a significant challenge. It was less a piece of headgear and more a mobile sensory deprivation chamber with a distressing tendency to clang loudly if you accidentally banged it on something. Prolonged wear could lead to pressure sores on the scalp or forehead. Then there was the scutum, the iconic, large, curved rectangular shield, the legionaries' primary defense, and a key component of Roman tactical formations like the testudo, tortoise. A magnificent piece of defensive engineering, constructed from layers of laminated wood, covered with painted linen or leather, edged with bronze or iron, and featuring a heavy iron or bronze boss, umbo, in the center that could be used to punch a barbarian's teeth down his throat in close combat. It was your best friend in a pitched battle, a mobile wall behind which you could shelter from a hail of missiles or the frenzied charge of an enemy. On the march, however, strapped to his back or carried on his arm, it was a 2 foot by 3.5 foot or larger slab of awkward, unwieldy, weighty misery. It constantly banged against your legs, caught the wind like a perverse and uncontrollable sail, threatening to throw you off balance on a narrow, treacherous mountain path, and its sheer size made navigating dense forest or scrambling over rough terrain a special kind of logistical hell. You learned to use it as an improvised windbreak, a very uncomfortable pillow, or even a makeshift tray for your miserable rations, but you never ever forgot it was there, a constant, heavy reminder of your profession. His offensive toolkit, the pointy bits designed to introduce Roman culture to the unwilling, was brutally effective, which one supposes is a definite positive if your job description includes the systematic depopulation of hostile territories or aggressive territorial acquisition. The gladius hispaniensis, the standard Roman short sword, typically with a blade around 2 feet long, was a brutally efficient stabbing and thrusting weapon designed for the murderous close-quarters work of the Roman battle line. It was well balanced, easy to use in the tight press of formations where a longer sword would be unwieldy, and it did its grim job with horrifying finality. It didn't break often if properly maintained, and there might have been a certain cold professional satisfaction in its reliability, a tool that, unlike many others in his kit, generally did what it was supposed to do without complaint. The 2 pila, those heavy, ingeniously designed throwing javelins, were his primary ranged weapon before closing for contact. Each was about 7 feet long overall, with a long, thin, soft iron shank behind the hardened pyramidal tip. The design meant that when it hit an enemy's shield, or body, the soft iron shank would often bend, rendering the pilum useless to be thrown back by the enemy, and crucially, making the enemy's shield unwieldy and difficult to use due to the encumbrance of the heavy dragging javelin. Clever. Also, 7 feet long and weighing several pounds each, meaning you had to lug these awkward top-heavy spears for hundreds of miles, usually one in hand and one strapped to your shield, before you got the, often single, crucial chance to hurl one in anger at an approaching foe. And let's not, for a moment, forget Gaius's vital role as a combat engineer, a digger of ditches, a builder of bridges, a constructor of empires. His entrenching tools were crude, heavy, and utterly indispensable for the nightly ritual of camp construction and the myriad other engineering tasks the Legion undertook. They were symbols of Rome's relentless ability to impose its will, its order, upon any landscape, however wild or hostile. But for Gaius, they were just more deadweight to carry, more sources of blisters, more instigators of aching muscles. The Dolabra, in particular, with its wickedly sharp edges, was also a potential hazard to its wielder or those nearby if handled carelessly by exhausted men in fading light. Yet amidst this daily catalog of equipment-related failings, frustrations, and outright betrayals, there was an undeniable, often terrifying effectiveness to much of this Roman kit, when it was properly maintained and used as intended by well-trained and disciplined men. The disciplined employment of shield and gladius by a century advancing in close order was a terrifyingly efficient meat grinder, capable of chewing through far larger but less organized barbarian hosts. The sight of a Roman legionary camp, bristling with sharpened stakes, its ditches deep and its ramparts high, rising as if by magic from a previously empty landscape in a few short hours, was a profound testament to the power of their tools, their training, and their sheer indomitable will. There was a grim, professional pride to be had in mastering this equipment, in keeping your gladius razor sharp and your armor meticulously functional, because your life and the lives of your contubernales, your 7 tentmates, depended directly and unequivocally upon it. This wasn't love for the tools, not by a long shot. It was a hard-bitten, pragmatic, often resentful respect, born of shared peril and the absolute necessity of survival. As for Gaius's state-of-the-art personal protective equipment beyond his actual armor, this consisted primarily of a coarse, itchy woolen tunic, or two, if he was lucky, one to wear while the other was theoretically drying, possibly a pair of equally coarse woolen breeches, bracci, in colder climes like the Alps or Britannia, a rather effeminate barbarian affectation that the Romans slowly, grudgingly adopted out of sheer chattering necessity, and his military cloak. This cloak, the sagum, a simple rectangle of heavy wool, or the hooded bienula, more common in inclement weather, was his all-purpose garment, raincoat, blanket, ground sheet, and occasional pillow. These items of apparel offered about as much genuine protection from a biting alpine wind that cut like a knife, a drenching week-long Britannic rain, or a determined swarm of Gallic mosquitoes with a thirst for Roman blood, as a strongly worded, eloquently phrased suggestion that the offending elements desist. Wool, to its credit, does retain some insulating properties even when thoroughly wet, but damp, smelly, and slightly less freezing than naked is not exactly a ringing endorsement for comfort. It was also famously, maddeningly itchy, especially when combined with days or weeks of accumulated sweat, grime, and irritating body lice. And his footwear, the legendary, much-lauded caligae. These heavy-duty military sandals were, in some respects, marvels of ancient engineering. Their open design offered excellent ventilation, which was fantastic for airing out your feet in hot, dry weather, preventing fungal infections like athlete's foot, in theory. They were also equally fantastic for allowing every variety of mud, slush, snow, freezing water, sharp stones, thorns, biting insects, and miscellaneous battlefield detritus direct, unimpeded access to your weary, protesting soles in every other kind of conceivable weather. The thick soles, constructed from multiple layers of leather, were studded with dozens of iron hobnails, clavi, which provided excellent traction on most surfaces and could inflict a nasty, disabling kick in a brawl. However, these hobnails also transmitted the cold from frozen ground directly into the wearer's feet with brutal efficiency, offered no cushioning whatsoever, and were notorious for causing spectacular, debilitating blisters, especially on new recruits whose feet hadn't yet been tortured into leathery, unfeeling stumps. Frostbitten toes acquired while wearing caligae in sub-zero temperatures were a legionary tradition in colder campaigns, a painful souvenir of Roman military fashion. Protection was clearly a highly relative and often hilariously inaccurate term in the Roman military vocabulary when it came to apparel. And yet, Despite this daily hourly catalog of failures, design flaws that seemed almost intentional in their cruelty, and outright infuriating betrayals at critical moments, these tools, these pieces of uncomfortable, heavy, and often dangerous kit, were Gaius's life. He cursed his Sarsena with every aching, jarring step. He loathed the relentless chafing of his armor straps and the way its weight bore down on his shoulders and spine. He muttered deeply personal and anatomically improbable imprecations at the Caligai that seemed to actively cultivate new and exciting blisters with each passing mile. But he also knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that without this collection of misery-inducing objects, he was almost certainly dead. His shield was his primary defense against a barbarian's spear or a well-aimed slingstone. His gladius, his only reliable means of reply in the bloody chaos of close combat. His entrenching tool, as much as he hated carrying and using it, secured his sleep, however fitful and inadequate, behind a defensive wall each night. So, he cared for them, with a grudging, resentful, almost ritualistic diligence. He'd spend precious hours in the flickering, smoky lamplight of the crowded tent, or by the inadequate glow of a shared campfire, sharpening his sword and dagger, carefully oiling the metal of his armor to ward off the ever-present rust, patching his worn tunic with clumsy stitches, replacing frayed leather straps on his armor or pack, and hammering loose or lost hobnails back into the soles of his accursed sandals. This wasn't affection. It was a deeply pragmatic, unsentimental understanding of mutual dependence, a begrudging partnership with inanimate objects that held his life in their flawed design. It was an unholy matrimony, a bond forged in shared misery, mutual disrespect, and the constant threat of annihilation, where each partner constantly threatened the well-being and comfort of the other, yet neither could realistically hope to survive alone in the brutal world they inhabited. He hated his gear with a passion, but it was his gear, the tangible, heavy, unyielding reality of his brutal, unforgiving profession, marching for the glory of Rome, particularly when that march involved dragging your protesting carcass over the god-forsaken Alps and into the perpetually soggy, barbarian-infested wilderness of Britannia, wasn't just a job description. It was a comprehensive, multi-year program for the systematic and often irreversible dismantling of the human body, and a relentless, insidious assault designed to stretch the mind to its absolute breaking point, and frequently beyond. For our long-suffering Gaius, every mile covered under a crushing load, every defensive ditch dug into unforgiving earth, every terrified, adrenaline-soaked skirmish, every night spent shivering on frozen ground was another indelible entry in a rapidly expanding, unaudited ledger of pain, weariness, and creeping despair. By the time he reached what a pampered, overfed noble lounging in a heated villa back in Rome might consider his vigorous late 20s or early 30s, our Gaius's body was already a living, breathing, groaning museum of occupational hazards. It was a walking, shuffling testament to the Roman army's unofficial but brutally effective motto: if it ain't broke, you haven't marched it far enough, flogged it hard enough, or exposed it to enough interesting foreign diseases. His spine, subjected to the daily compression of 80-plus pounds of ill-distributed gear and the jarring, repetitive impact of literally millions of steps on unforgiving, uneven terrain, likely resembled a gnarled, twisted olive branch more than a healthy human vertebral column. Chronic, debilitating back pain wasn't an occasional symptom to be managed with a bit of rest. It was a legionary's constant companion, as reliable and unwelcome as the sunrise, or the next demand for unpaid labor. He probably couldn't remember what it felt like not to have an ache in his lower back. His joints would sing a constant, agonizing aria of agony with every single step, a percussive symphony of clicks, pops, grating noises, and deep, grinding aches that no amount of cheap wine could fully numb. Arthritis, a condition most civilians wouldn't expect until their twilight years, wasn't a disease of old age for a legionary. It was a common mid-career milestone, an unwelcome promotion in the ranks of the chronically afflicted. His feet, those poor, abused, utterly essential servants encased for hours on end in their hobnailed torture chambers, were a veritable roadmap of misery, layers upon layers of old and new blisters, some weeping, some blood-filled, persistent, itchy fungal infections thriving in the perpetually damp, unhygienic conditions between his toes, calluses as thick and insensitive as old boot leather, which then cracked painfully, and the ever-present, throbbing ache of strained ligaments and collapsed arches. He probably hadn't seen his toenails in their natural, healthy color for years, hidden as they were beneath layers of grime, blood, and infection. Hernias, those painful protrusions of internal organs through weakened abdominal walls, were practically a legionary fashion statement, blooming with alarming regularity from the immense strain of constant heavy lifting, digging fortifications, and generally contorting oneself under crushing loads. His hands, oh, his magnificent, ruined hands, once perhaps capable of delicate work or a gentle touch, they were now less flesh and blood, more gnarled wood, scar tissue, and ingrained filth. From gripping the rough wood of the pilum shaft for hours on end, the cold iron of the gladius hilt in a sweaty, desperate grip, the unforgiving handle of the delabra while smashing rocks or frozen earth, and hauling on coarse, abrasive ropes during engineering tasks or when manhandling siege equipment. Rope burns, splinters that festered into angry sores, and calluses so thick they had their own calluses were standard issue, making fine motor skills a distant, fading memory. Skin diseases, an entire encyclopedia of them, were just part of the rich, septic tapestry of daily discomfort. From the raw, weeping abrasions of chafing that felt like being vigorously scrubbed with coarse sandpaper, to persistent, maddeningly itchy fungal blooms in the groin, armpits, and other unmentionable places where sweat and dirt accumulated, these were constant companions. Exposure to relentless sun, biting wind, and freezing cold would leave his face a cracked, leathery, permanently wind-burnt mask, making him look a good decade, if not two, older than his actual chronological years. And his teeth? Let's just say the standard legionary diet wasn't exactly endorsed by Roman dentists, assuming such a highfalutin luxury even existed outside the capital for anyone but the fabulously wealthy. Broken, missing, loose, or agonizingly aching teeth were just another flavor of daily misery to be endured, often treated on campaign by a designated comrade, usually the biggest and least squeamish one in the contubernium, armed with a pair of rusty pliers, a strong stomach, and absolutely no anesthetic beyond perhaps a shared prayer to a minor god of suffering. The screams during such extractions were usually brief, but memorable. Eye problems were rampant. The blinding glare of the sun off snowfields in the Alps, or off his comrade's polished helmet during a summer march, the constant sting of alkaline dust thrown up by thousands of marching feet, or the acrid smoke from poorly ventilated campfires, all led to chronic inflammation, squinting, a slow degradation of vision, and recurrent infections like trachoma. Every wound, every minor battlefield injury from a training mishap, a drunken brawl, or a clumsy stumble on a treacherous path, left its mark, an untidy, often poorly healed archive of pain etched permanently onto his flesh. He was, in short, a slowly crumbling, walking, talking monument to the greater glory of Rome, and a testament to the human body's astonishing, if ultimately finite, capacity for punishment. But it wasn't just the spectacular external injuries or the slow, grinding wear and tear of joints and muscles that Gaius had to contend with. Oh no. The unique lifestyle of a Roman legionary on extended campaign was also a prolific incubator and distributor of fascinating and debilitating internal afflictions, turning his insides into a vibrant, if deeply unwelcome and often violently rebellious, ecosystem. Dysentery, charmingly known by the troops as the flux, the shits, or the Roman two-step, was a frequent and deeply unwelcome visitor, capable of sweeping through entire cohorts with democratic and dehydrating impartiality. Contaminated water sources, improperly cooked or spoiled food, clouds of flies buzzing between latrine trenches and cooking pots, and thousands of men living in close, often spectacularly unsanitary. Proximity made it an ever-present and highly debilitating threat. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was prostrating, leading to severe dehydration, electrolyte imbalance, fever, and a weakness so profound that even lifting your head felt like a major undertaking. It also stripped away any last vestiges of dignity a man might possess. Fevers of various, often unspecified and untreatable, natures were as common as complaints about the food, perhaps malaria in marshy areas of Gaul, or later in the fens of Britannia, carried by whining mosquitoes, or typhus, spread by the body lice that were his constant itchy companions and unwelcome bedfellows. These fevers brought racking chills, burning sweats, delirium, and often death. Respiratory infections, from a persistent hacking cough that never quite seemed to leave him, earning him the nickname Old Barky from his tentmates, to full-blown, life-threatening pneumonia, were inevitable hazards of prolonged exposure to relentless cold, driving rain, and damp sleeping conditions. The very air he breathed, thick with dust on the march or wood smoke in camp, seemed to conspire against his lungs. And let's not, for a moment, forget the insidious, cumulative joys of chronic malnutrition and dehydration. While the Roman army, in theory, tried to provide adequate sustenance for its fighting men, the reality on long, arduous campaigns in hostile, remote territory often fell disastrously short of the ideal. The standard diet of mainly grain, issued as whole kernels that the men had to grind themselves into coarse flour for their hardtack bread or lumpy porridge, supplemented with some vegetables if they were exceptionally lucky or stationed near a friendly farm, a bit of heavily salted bacon or pork fat, some hard cheese, and the ubiquitous vinegary pasca was designed for basic caloric sustenance, not for robust, vibrant health or optimal immune function. Vitamin deficiencies, particularly of vitamin C, leading to the swollen gums, loose teeth, and internal bleeding of scurvy on very long sea voyages or isolated winter garrisons, were a real threat, though the vinegar and pasca might have offered some slight, accidental protection. More commonly, a general lack of fresh food led to lowered immunity, making every minor scratch or infection potentially life-threatening, poor wound healing, night blindness, and a general lack of vitality and cognitive sharpness. This all contributed to a level of profound, bone-deep, soul-crushing exhaustion that a few hours of fitful, interrupted sleep, frequently punctuated by guard duty, camp alarms, or the agonized groans of his tentmates, barely began to dent. This wasn't just a normal tiredness after a hard day's work. It was an existential weariness that settled into his very marrow, a leaden weight he carried with him always. Yet paradoxically, almost perversely, this constant brutal assault on his physical well-being, this daily dance with injury, illness, and exhaustion, forged a certain grim, unyielding resilience in those like Gaius who somehow managed to survive it. They developed a capacity to endure, to function, to keep placing one foot in front of the other through levels of pain, sickness, and fatigue that would seem utterly superhuman, if not suicidal, to most of us today. It wasn't a joyful or admirable resilience born of inner peace and positive thinking. It was a hardened, calloused, stoic acceptance of suffering as the baseline, immutable condition of their existence. They learned to read their bodies' increasingly frantic warning signs, not as urgent signals to stop, rest, and recover, but as mere suggestions to be noted, perhaps cursed at, and then largely, necessarily, ignored if duty, or the centurion's vine staff, demanded otherwise. This brutal, unforgiving tempering process, while horrifically costly in terms of human suffering and shortened lifespans, did, undeniably, create men of almost unbelievable physical and mental toughness, a positive outcome, if one can call it that, from an utterly comprehensively negative process. They were survivors, in the grimmest, most literal sense of the word. While Gaius's battered body was engaged in a constant losing battle against the relentless rigors of his profession, his mind, his inner world, was fighting its own silent, often far more terrifying war. This war was waged in conditions of profound psychological stress, often in a state of terrifying isolation, despite being constantly surrounded by thousands of his comrades. There was the ever-present low-frequency hum of background fear. Fear of the next sudden, shrieking barbarian ambush erupting from the dark, silent forest. Fear of the arbitrary and often savage brutality of the centurion's vine staff for some minor unintentional infraction. Fear of the invisible, insidious creep of disease that could lay a strong man low in days. Fear of a crippling, disabling injury that would leave him a burden or an outcast. And perhaps the deepest, most gnawing fear of all, the fear of dying alone, unmourned, and unremembered in some nameless, muddy bog at the arse end of the known world. His body left for the crows, and his name forgotten by an indifferent empire. He'd seen men captured by certain particularly enthusiastic tribes in Germania or Britannia, and the stories of what happened to them afterwards were enough to curdle the blood and fuel nightmares for weeks. Then there was the sheer, soul-crushing, mind-numbing monotony of it all. March, build camp, eat badly, sleep badly, stand watch, repeat. Day after identical day, week after identical week, month after identical, spirit-eroding month. The landscape might change, from the terrifying, snow-capped majesty of the Alps to the endless, sodden, claustrophobic forests of the north, or the wind-swept, desolate plains of some new frontier. But the brutal, unchanging routine remained a constant, a psychological straitjacket. This could lead to a kind of dull, dangerous apathy, a mental checking out that could get a man or his comrades killed through a moment's inattention. Dehumanization was a subtle, creeping poison. Gaius was one face among thousands, a number in a century, an interchangeable cog in the vast, impersonal, clanking machine of Roman military power. His individual hopes, fears, dreams, and desires counted for precious little against the grand strategic objectives of generals he'd never meet, and emperors whose statues he might occasionally see, but whose reality was a universe away. This profound lack of agency, this constant sense of being an expendable, replaceable pawn in a game whose rules he didn't understand, and whose stakes were far removed from his own life, could erode a man's spirit, leaving behind a hollowed-out husk of cynical resignation or bitter resentment. The witnessing of brutal punishment served as a constant, visceral reminder of his own precarious position and the army's ruthless disregard for individual suffering, homesickness. A deep, aching, visceral longing for familiar faces, places, smells, sounds, and even for the familiar, less life-threatening miseries of his former civilian life, was a constant, unwelcome companion for many. Letters from home, if they came at all, were rare, precious, and often months out of date, carried by merchants or official couriers across vast, dangerous distances. News was always old news. The sheer geographical separation and the ever-present uncertainty of survival made the prospect of ever returning, of seeing his family or his village again, a distant, fragile, almost unbelievable hope, a dream he barely dared to entertain for fear of jinxing it. Coping mechanisms, such as they were, varied. Some found a grim solace in the black gallows humor that thrives in such desperate environments. What's the difference between a legionary and a pile of dung? The dung gets to stay in one place. Others turn to gambling, wagering their meager pay, their next ration of wine, or even pieces of their equipment on games of chance played with knucklebones, tally, or simple dice, seeking a fleeting thrill of excitement, or a momentary illusion of control in a life utterly devoid of either. The fleeting comfort of cheap, sour wine, when it was available as part of the ration or purchasable from opportunistic camp followers, lixae, offered a temporary blurring of the harsh edges of reality, a brief respite in alcoholic oblivion. though often followed by a truly monumental hangover that made the next day's march even more hellish. Many clung to superstitions, to lucky amulets, to whispered prayers to minor local deities or to the spirits of place, hoping for some measure of supernatural protection or a moment of good fortune. The bonds forged with his contubernales, his 7 tent mates, were absolutely crucial, perhaps the single most important factor in psychological survival. These men, who shared his freezing tent, his miserable rations, his deepest fears, and his unrelenting daily suffering, became a surrogate family, a brotherhood, forged in the unholy fires of shared adversity. They heard his snores, he smelled their feet. They might have a quiet conversation huddled in the tent after a brutal day, a shared, illicitly obtained piece of fruit, a story from home whispered in the dark, a comforting hand on the shoulder after a near miss in a skirmish. These small acts of kindness and connection were lifelines in an ocean of brutality. This camaraderie, born not of gentle affection but of mutual dependence and a raw, unspoken understanding of their appalling shared lot, was perhaps the most significant positive mental outcome. They might bicker and curse each other over a stolen bit of bread or an unfair share of latrine duty, but in the face of external threat or overwhelming misery, they were often, quite literally, all each other had. But for some, inevitably, the relentless psychological strain was too much. The vacant 1,000-yard stares, the sudden inexplicable outbursts of rage over trivialities, the retreat into profound unreachable silence, the weeping fits in the dead of night, these were the signs of minds cracking under a burden too great for any mortal to bear for long. The Romans didn't have a diagnostic term for post-traumatic stress disorder, but its shadow undoubtedly fell long, dark, and chillingly familiar over the legions, in every fort, on every frontier. Gaius's inner world, if he was to survive with his sanity even partially intact, likely became a heavily fortified redoubt of stoic resignation, its walls built of cynicism and bitter experience, punctuated only by occasional quickly suppressed flashes of impotent anger or a bleak, weary, all-encompassing cynicism that saw glory as a well-marketed lie, and mere, grubby survival as the only true, attainable victory. So our Gaius is a meticulously crafted masterpiece of applied physical and psychological suffering, a walking, groaning testament to the Roman army's unparalleled ability to grind men down to their very essence and then demand a little more. But he wasn't performing this agonizing ballet of imperial expansion entirely alone in a vacuum. Oh no. He was constantly surrounded by a rich, varied, and often deeply irritating cast of human characters, most of whom, it often seemed to Gaius, were either actively dedicated to making his already appalling existence just that little bit more uniquely special, or were simply too wrapped up in their own misery to offer much in the way of comfort or assistance. In Gaius's tightly corseted military world, the clients, passengers, or employers from hell were, almost without exception, his officers, the men entrusted by the distant, godlike emperor and the even more distant senate to lead him to glorious victory, or, as was far more often the case, to simply lead him through endless miles of inhospitable mud and unnecessary peril, with a combination of maximum officiousness, minimal competence, and an almost breathtaking disregard for his continued well-being or existence. His most immediate, unavoidable, and often most significant human tormentor was likely his centurion. This was the hardened, leathery, non-commissioned officer, the very backbone, sinew, and occasionally the pain in the arse of the legion, often a man who had risen slowly and painfully through the ranks by dint of being tougher, meaner, more cunning, or simply more enduringly stubborn than anyone else around him. The centurion was the one who directly implemented discipline, assigned duties, and led the 80 men of his century into whatever fresh hell the higher-ups had devised. He was the one with the vites, the iconic Roman vine staff, which he wielded with the creative enthusiasm of a concert pianist with a grudge, and the judicious mercy of a starving wolf contemplating a particularly plump sheep. A good centurion knew his men, understood the absolute limits of their endurance, and precisely how to push them just a fraction beyond that limit without actually killing too many of them. And crucially, led from the front, sharing at least some of the dangers, if not always the discomforts. He might, on rare occasions, even earn a grudging, fearful respect from his men. This rare specimen was the positive outlier, the officer who might, for example, ensure a vaguely fairish distribution of recently acquired rations, or who wouldn't actively seek to make your life demonstrably worse than the already appalling baseline set by the official regulations. A veritable saint by prevailing legionary standards. One such centurion, let's call him Titus Pullo for argument's sake, though probably not that one, might have been known for his booming laugh after a successful skirmish, a rough but fair hand with punishments, and an uncanny ability to find a dry patch of ground for the century to camp on, even in the middle of a Britannic monsoon. His men might curse him under their breath during a forced march, but they'd follow him into hell, or at least into Wales. More commonly, however, the centurion was a figure of profound dread, a walking, talking personification of arbitrary power and potential pain. His primary qualifications for the job often seemed to be a congenital inability to smile, an encyclopedic and instantly recallable knowledge of even the most obscure minor infractions for which to assign brutal and inventive punishments, flogging with the flagrum, extra guard duties in appalling weather, latrine detail for a month, being forced to stand at attention holding his shield aloft until his arms gave out, and an intimate, almost loving relationship with that vine staff, which he used to correct, encourage, or simply educate his men on everything from a poorly tied sandal lace or a speck of rust on a helmet, to a perceived lack of sufficient enthusiasm during a dawn charge up a muddy, spear-bristling hill. He was the tangible, ever-present face of Roman military discipline, and that face usually had a permanent, deeply etched scowl, small, suspicious eyes that missed nothing, and a voice that could strip paint from a shield at 50 paces, or curdle milk at 100. Think of a certain R. Lee Ermey character, but in sandals and with a much worse temper. Then there was the Optio, the centurion's second in command, his right-hand man, often an ambitious, career-minded individual from the ranks, eagerly striving to demonstrate his own leadership potential and catch the eye of his superiors for future promotion. This demonstration usually involved being even more pedantic, by the book, and generally annoying than the centurion himself. If the centurion was the rumbling, unpredictable thunder of divine wrath, the Optio was often the incessant, buzzing, blood-sucking mosquito of military hierarchy, always there, always watching, meticulously noting down names, ready to report the tiniest deviation from the norm, the slightest hint of insubordination, or even just a really good barracks room rumor. He was the one who made sure your kit was laid out exactly according to regulations for inspection, even if those regulations made no practical sense whatsoever on campaign. Higher up the gilded chain of command were the tribunes, of which there were several in each legion. These were often young, inexperienced aristocrats from wealthy senatorial or equestrian families back in Rome, serving a relatively short stint in the army as a compulsory stepping stone in their cursus honorum, their political and social career path. Some were genuinely competent, keen to learn the business of soldiering, and eager to earn the respect of the men they nominally commanded. Many, however, viewed their legionary charges with a mixture of ill-concealed disdain, profound bewilderment, and a sort of detached anthropological curiosity, as if they were a particularly unruly, smelly, and regrettably necessary species of talking pack animal. Their practical understanding of soldiering, of logistics, of what it actually meant to march 20 miles a day in full kit through knee-deep mud, might be limited to what they'd read in heavily romanticized, historically dubious Greek and Roman histories. An incompetent, arrogant, or simply clueless young tribune could be an unmitigated disaster, ordering marches into impassable terrain based on a misreading of a crude map, fatally underestimating local tribal resistance, or making catastrophic logistical blunders that left the men starving, freezing, and dangerously exposed, all while looking terribly dashing and important in his gleaming, custom-made breastplate and expensively dyed cloak. Gaius and his mates probably saw them as distant, perfumed, utterly useless peacocks, whose ill-informed decisions, often made in the relative comfort of a large, well-appointed command tent with plentiful wine and obsequious staff at hand, translated directly and immediately into more suffering, more danger, and more pointless toil for him and every other poor sod in the ranks. And the legate, the overall commander of the entire legion, often a senator of consular rank, appointed directly by the emperor. He was a remote, almost godlike figure, rarely seen by the common soldier, except perhaps during a formal address before a major battle, full of stirring, if largely unbelievable, rhetoric about glory and duty, or when dispensing particularly solemn and public punishments for major offenses like mutiny or cowardice. His strategic genius, or his catastrophic career-ending failures, directly shaped Gaius's fate and the fate of thousands. But to Gaius himself, the legate was mostly an abstract, distant concept, the ultimate unseen source of the orders that made his life a relentless, wearying slog across the face of the earth. Did anyone ever sidle up to Gaius after he'd spent 10 grueling hours hauling his guts out over a windswept mountain pass, dug his regulation 7-foot section of defensive ditch in frozen earth, and then stood shivering for 4 hours on guard duty in the freezing, pissing rain and say, "Well done, old boy. Jolly good effort not dying or deserting today. Rome and the emperor personally truly appreciate your stoic, uncomplaining endurance of abject, unrelenting misery? Unlikely. In fact, laughably so. Gratitude in the Roman legions was a foreign currency, rarely minted, and even more rarely distributed to the rank and file. Praise was for heroes in epic poems, not for muddy, lice-ridden grunts doing their job. Your reward for a hard day's work was usually the unambiguous promise of another, equally hard, if not harder, day's work on the morrow. Competence in your duties was not praised. It was simply assumed and ruthlessly demanded. Extraordinary effort was expected as the norm. And failure, or even the slightest perceived hint of slacking, was met with swift, often disproportionately painful, correction. You weren't generally seen or valued as a skilled individual, even though to survive you had to become incredibly skilled in a wide range of unpleasant and dangerous tasks. You were Miles Gregarious, a common soldier, one of the herd, a replaceable, expendable part in the vast, clanking, blood-oiled, and eternally hungry machine of Roman expansion and imperial control. The grand strategy, the glory of the empire, the economic benefits of newly conquered territories. These were lofty, abstract concerns for senators in their togas and emperors on their thrones. For Gaius, the daily inescapable reality was the crushing weight of his pack, the gnawing ache in his bones, the damp chill in his tunic, and the cold knot of fear in his gut. He was an instrument, a tool, like his shovel or his sword, and tools don't get thank you notes or performance bonuses. His value to the state was measured not in his humanity, but in his brutal ability to march, to fight, to dig, and to obey, until he could do so no longer, at which point he would be discarded and replaced. The irony of fighting to establish the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, while his own life was one of constant violence, fear, and harsh discipline, was probably lost on him, or perhaps just filed away under things too depressing to contemplate. Now, that's not to say there wasn't any sense of accomplishment or recognition, however grim or fleeting. Successfully repelling a sudden, desperate barbarian ambush against the odds, completing a complex and dangerous engineering feat like throwing a pontoon bridge across a fast-flowing river under enemy fire, or simply surviving a particularly brutal stretch of campaigning where many others fell. These could bring a dark, visceral, shared pride among the surviving men. Sometimes, a truly exceptional act of individual bravery in battle might even earn a decoration or even a public word of gruff, almost embarrassed praise from a centurion or a higher officer during a formal assembly. These moments were so incredibly rare, they'd be recounted, embellished, and talked about in awed whispers around campfires for weeks, if not months. These were not expressions of soft, sentimental gratitude, but hard-won public acknowledgments of martial virtue, fleeting pinpricks of brilliant, dazzling recognition in an otherwise vast and indifferent universe of anonymous, unthanked toil. And on a larger, more collective scale, being part of a veteran, victorious legion, one with a fearsome reputation and a long list of battle honors, could instill a certain swagger, a collective arrogance, a deeply ingrained sense that they were the best, the toughest, the most feared fighting force in the world, however much it comprehensively sucked to be one of them on a daily basis. This was a form of positive identity, however brutal its underpinnings. Gaius's companions in this mobile, open-air purgatory, his fellow legionaries, were a decidedly mixed bag, a truly motley, often malodorous microcosm of the Roman Empire's vast and varied underbelly. They were disillusioned farmers, dispossessed laborers, debtors fleeing their creditors. Petty criminals offered a choice between the legions and the mines, a genuinely terrible choice, and the occasional hopeful or desperate provincial seeking a better life, or at least a different kind of misery than the one he was born into, all thrown together by fate, desperation, economic necessity, or a particularly persuasive and mendacious recruitment officer. They came from every corner of the empire, each with his own dialect, his own local gods, and his own unique repertoire of complaints. His closest, most unavoidable companions would have been his contubernales, the 7 other men who shared his 8-man leather tent, papilio, his single cooking pot, his meager fire when allowed, and his unrelenting, bone-deep misery. This was where the strongest, most resilient, and often most dysfunctional bonds were forged, in the inescapable crucible of shared daily hardship and mutual suffering. They knew each other's snores, coughs, farts, and capacity for creatively obscene cursing in at least 3 languages. They covered for each other during surprise inspections by officious optios, discreetly shared scrounged or stolen morsels of extra food, ineptly but earnestly dressed each other's minor wounds, a dab of wine and a dirty rag being the standard field dressing, and provided the closest, most tangible thing to a family Gaius would know for the long, weary years of his service. Laughter, when it occurred, was usually a harsh, barking, explosive sound, typically at someone else's misfortune. A spectacular trip and fall in the mud, a direct hit by a bird dropping, or in response to a joke so dark, so cynical, so utterly inappropriate, it would make Pluto himself wince and possibly take notes. This was the primary positive human element in Gaius's grim world. A fierce, often unspoken, deeply pragmatic loyalty, born not of sentimental affection, but of raw, naked mutual dependence and a shared, profound understanding of their appalling collective lot. They were all, quite literally, in the same stinking, leaking, overloaded boat, or rather, marching column, heading towards the same uncertain, probably unpleasant, destination. You stick by your mates, they stick by you, or you all end up as crow food, might have been their unwritten motto. But constant privation, grinding exhaustion, gnawing fear, and the inherently brutalizing nature of their profession could also, quite easily, turn men inward, suspicious, and mean, bringing out the absolute worst in them. Petty theft within the contubernium or the century wasn't uncommon. A filched piece of hardtack from someone's pack, a borrowed blanket that never quite found its way back to its owner, a contested share of wine. Grudges born from some perceived slight or an unfair division of labor could fester for weeks in the oppressive, close-quarters environment, sometimes exploding into vicious, bloody brawls that the centurions would then break up with swift, indiscriminate, and extremely painful efficiency, usually involving the liberal application of the vites to everyone involved. There was an unspoken, often brutally enforced pecking order, with grizzled, scar-faced veterans lording it over terrified new recruits, tirones, often educating them with a delightful mixture of cruel, humiliating pranks, like being sent to fetch a skyhook or a left-handed shield stretcher, and genuinely life-saving, if harshly, cynically delivered, advice on how to avoid getting killed by the enemy, the environment, or indeed their own officers. You learned quickly who to trust with your life, a very short list, who to merely trust with your spare pair of socks, a slightly longer list, who to avoid like the plague, usually a much longer list, and whose apocalyptic snoring was so disruptive it merited a carefully aimed and deniable boot to the ribs in the middle of the night. Mostly, though, it was a matter of collective, trudging endurance. They complained together, usually in hushed, bitter tones around the dying embers of a campfire. They shivered together under inadequate cloaks during freezing night watches. They starved together when supply lines failed. They marched together until their feet were bloody stumps. And when the terrifying, chaotic time came, they fought and often died, together, shield wall to shield wall, their lives depending on the man to their left and the man to their right. There was a grim, almost perverse sort of camaraderie in knowing that every other poor, cursed bastard around you was suffering just as much, if not more, than you were. It didn't make the Alpine passes any flatter, the Britannic weather any less relentlessly depressing, or the Centurion any less of a vindictive bully. But it made the crushing burden of it all, just occasionally, for a fleeting moment, a fractional, almost imperceptible bit more bearable. After a delightful day of being systematically screamed at by centurions whose vocal cords seemed to be forged from brass and powered by pure spite, of being chafed raw by his ill-fitting armor until his skin felt like one giant open wound, and of generally being treated like a particularly dim-witted and expendable pack mule with unfortunate delusions of grandeur, our hero Gaius could at least look forward to the legendary luxuries and creature comforts afforded to a Roman legionary on active campaign. Except, of course, luxuries, in this specific context, is a word so hilariously, tragically divorced from actual reality that it might as well be speaking Parthian, or perhaps conversing with the woodland sprites the local Britons seemed so fond of. Let's start with the highlight of any legionary's day. Dining as a Roman legionary on the march, especially in remote hostile territories like the Alps or the less developed parts of Britannia, was an experience best forgotten, or at least heavily repressed with the aid of copious amounts of cheap wine when available. The absolute staple of Gaius's diet, the primary fuel for his imperial exploits and a key ingredient in his chronic constipation, was grain. Usually wheat, sometimes barley if the harvest had been poor, or the quartermaster particularly corrupt. This was issued as whole, unground kernels, which meant that Gaius and his 7 contubernales then had the distinct daily pleasure of grinding it themselves into coarse, gritty flour using a small, absurdly heavy, and universally detested hand mill, the manus molla, or molla versatilis. This charming device, typically consisting of 2 circular stones, the top one turned by a wooden handle, was carried by one unlucky man in the tent group, usually the newest recruit or the one who had lost the previous night's gambling session. The process was laborious, time-consuming, and produced a fine, irritating dust that got into everything: eyes, nostrils, lungs. The resultant flour wasn't the fine, silky, artisanal stone-ground product you might find in a quaint village bakery today. This was coarse, gritty stuff, frequently containing bonus, unwelcome particles of sand, dirt, fragments of the millstone itself, and the occasional surprised and subsequently pulverized weevil or grain beetle, adding a little extra, unwanted protein. From this unpromising base, they would then produce either hardtack biscuits or a sort of thick, glutinous porridge, or gruel, pulls, that had all the visual and gustatory appeal of wet cement, and often a similar texture. To accompany this delightful culinary centerpiece, there might be rations of bacon or salt pork, so heavily and imperfectly preserved it could likely survive an apocalypse, and indeed often tasted like it already had, with a disturbingly greenish tinge and a formidable aroma. Perhaps some hard, dry cheese, if it hadn't yet developed its own independent and hostile ecosystem of molds and mites. Lentils or beans, if the supply lines were feeling particularly generous, or if the legion was static for a while, were boiled into a bland, often smoky-tasting slop that was filling, if not exactly inspiring, and usually led to some impressive nocturnal orchestral performances within the confines of the tent. The legionaries' signature beverage, the ubiquitous posca, That invigorating and mildly antiseptic blend of sour wine or vinegar and water has already been mentioned. It was hydrating, true, and the acidity probably did kill some of the more interesting bacteria lurking in questionable water sources. It also possessed a certain assertive, eye-watering tang that could strip enamel from teeth at 20 paces and effectively scour a dirty cooking pot. Sometimes, if foraging was permitted by a lenient officer, or more likely, discreetly overlooked when rations were particularly dire, the men might supplement their meager official diet with whatever they could scavenge. Liberate from hostile territory, a euphemism for theft with menaces, or hunt, if they were lucky and skilled. This could range from a few bitter wild herbs or berries, a scrawny stringy rabbit, some dubious-looking mushrooms, a risky game of gastrointestinal roulette, or perhaps even a very confused and indignant local chicken that had wandered too close to the camp perimeter. These were rare treasured treats in a vast, monotonous desert of culinary despair, moments of flavor in a world of blandness. The taste of a freshly roasted, if undersized, field mouse could seem like a feast fit for Jupiter after weeks of nothing but gritty hardtack. The risks of such illicit foraging, however, were severe if caught. Cooking, such as it was a group affair, performed by the 8 men of the contubernium over a small, smoky, open fire, using a single shared bronze cooking pot, patera or situla, and whatever limited battered utensils they possessed between them. Imagine 8 tired, cold, wet, grumpy, and extremely hungry men, all with strong opinions and short tempers, trying to agree on how to not completely ruin their already depressing and inadequate daily meal. The results were, predictably, robust, and often led to further arguments. And yet, amidst this unrelenting festival of blandness, grit, and potential food poisoning, there was a certain grim, almost perverse security. Unlike many a starving peasant back home, whose entire existence depended on the whims of weather, landlords, and local market prices, Gaius, as a soldier of Rome, usually got his rations. They were frequently awful, often insufficient, and almost always crushingly monotonous. Yes, but they were, for the most part, reliably awful. There was a strange, perverse luxury in that very predictability, a bedrock of sustenance, however unappetizing. Furthermore, the very act of transforming raw, unpromising grain into something vaguely edible, of huddling with his tent mates around a sputtering, inadequate fire in the heart of a hostile, freezing wilderness to share a meager, smoky, and often undercooked meal, fostered a rough-hewn, almost primal camaraderie. It was a shared daily ritual of survival, a tiny, smoky pocket of collective human endeavor in an otherwise isolating and abnormal world. And on those exceedingly rare, almost legendary occasions when they managed to scrounge, steal, or miraculously receive something extra, it tasted better, more intensely wonderful than any imaginable imperial banquet in Rome, simply because it was a small defiant victory against the pervasive, grinding deprivation that defined their lives. After a gourmet meal of gritty hardtack, rancid bacon, and existential despair, Gaius could thankfully retire to his palatial sleeping quarters. His palace, as previously noted, was 1/8 of a papilio, that distinctive wedge-shaped tent, made of thick stitched panels of goatskin or calfskin leather, supported by a central pole and a ridge pole, and shared in intimate, unfragrant proximity with his 7 tent mates. Cozy would be one, extraordinarily charitable word for it. Cramped, stuffy, eye-wateringly smelly, and perpetually damp would be a far more accurate, if less appealing, description. These leather tents, while relatively durable, offered only a modicum of protection from heavy rain. They eventually leaked, usually right over your head. Driving wind, which could threaten to rip them from their pegs. And certainly not much against the bitter, penetrating cold of an alpine night or the pervasive, bone-chilling damp of a Britannic winter. They accumulated condensation on the inside, which then dripped down onto the occupants. And if anyone was foolish or desperate enough to try and build a small, smoky fire inside for a little warmth, strictly against regulations and incredibly dangerous, the tent would fill with acrid, choking smoke with astonishing speed, adding carbon monoxide poisoning to the list of potential hazards. The smell inside, after a few days of continuous rain with 8 unwashed, sweating, farting men crammed inside, was something that defied polite description. A rich, complex bouquet of old socks, stale fear, mildew, damp leather, and indigestion. His bed, the cold, hard, and invariably lumpy ground. No spring mattresses or memory foam toppers for Rome's finest. If he was lucky, he might have his heavy woolen cloak, sagum, to spread beneath him for a pathetic illusion of padding. If he was really lucky, and in a semi-permanent camp where regulations were slightly relaxed and opportunity arose, he might surreptitiously gather some dry straw, bracken, or leaves to create a slightly less unyielding surface. But usually, it was just him, the unforgiving earth, and the various small, scurrying, slithering, or biting things that also called that particular patch of ground home. Field mice, voles, spiders, centipedes, and in warmer climes, the occasional inquisitive snake seeking warmth. Privacy, within the confines of the papilio, was a concept as alien and unimaginable as a scented bath with Nubian serving girls. The nightly symphony of varied and often truly apocalyptic snores, guttural coughs, feverish muttering, groans of pain, and occasional uninhibited flatulence from his 7 closely packed companions, was his inescapable lullaby, a soundtrack to his fitful dreams. However, the true shelter, the real, if exhausting and labor-intensive, luxury in terms of physical security, was the fortified marching camp itself. That miracle of Roman military engineering erected anew each night. That deep defensive ditch, that imposing earthen rampart, that bristling, impenetrable palisade of sharpened stakes, transformed a patch of wild, hostile, barbarian-infested wilderness into a relatively secure, ordered perimeter for the night. Inside those formidable defenses, however rudimentary the personal comforts, however appalling the food and company, there was a measure of collective safety from surprise attacks by disgruntled locals or organized enemy forces. This hard-won collective security, bought fresh each evening with hours of collective, back-breaking labor, was perhaps the most significant and genuinely appreciated luxury the Roman army provided its soldiers on campaign. It was the crucial difference between attempting to sleep with one eye open in constant, jangling terror of a spear in the dark, and attempting to sleep with one eye open merely in mild, routine apprehension of the centurion's boot at dawn. Progress, of a sort. The notion that night, the period between the setting and rising of the sun, was for uninterrupted, blissful, restorative sleep, was another charming fairy tale, perhaps told to soft, pampered city dwellers in Rome, but certainly not part of the operational reality for Gaius and his comrades. For a Roman legionary on active campaign, sleep was a precious, often cruelly rationed, and highly perishable commodity, frequently interrupted, rarely satisfying, and almost never long enough. If you weren't jolted rudely awake from your shallow slumber by the agonizing throb of your protesting muscles, the gnawing acidic pangs of hunger in your empty belly, the urgent, insistent pressure on your bladder, demanding a risky trip out into the cold, dark, and potentially dangerous camp periphery, or the sudden, violent coughing fit of the man pressed up against you. There were plenty of other delightful, sleep-murdering diversions. First and foremost, of course, was guard duty. Every legionary, from the rawest recruit to the grizzled veteran, took his regular turn standing watch on the ramparts, at the gates, or at key listening posts, usually for several miserable hours in the dead of night in all weathers. This involved peering intently into the inky, often terrifying darkness, every rustle of leaves in the nearby forest, every snap of a distant twig, every hoot of an owl or bark of a fox, a potential sign of an approaching enemy, sending a jolt of adrenaline through your exhausted system. In winter, this meant slowly freezing into a human icicle. In summer, it meant being eaten alive by mosquitoes while struggling to stay awake. Even when not officially on duty, the ambient sounds of a large military camp all conspired against achieving deep, restful slumber. Emergency tasks could, and frequently did, drag men from their tents at any hour without warning. A sudden, violent storm might threaten to collapse a section of the rampart, requiring all available hands to effect emergency repairs in the driving rain and howling wind. A suspected enemy probe, or even just a particularly adventurous badger or deer blundering into the defensive ditch, could trigger a full camp alarm, sending thousands of men scrambling for their weapons and armor in the pitch dark, hearts pounding, ready to repel an attack that often turned out to be a false alarm, leaving everyone cold, wet, and thoroughly annoyed. And even if, by some minor miracle of Mars or Fortuna, external disturbances were minimal, the sheer, unmitigated physical discomfort of trying to sleep on the hard, often damp, ground in a cramped, smelly, poorly ventilated tent, pressed up against 7 other equally uncomfortable and restless men, often made deep, restorative slumber a rare and precious commodity indeed. Gaius would frequently wake up in the gray, pre-dawn gloom feeling almost as tired, if not more so, than when he had collapsed into his tent the previous evening, the profound fatigue a cumulative, ever-increasing debt that his body just kept accruing, with no prospect of ever paying it off. The only real positive to be found in this dismal nocturnal landscape was the profound, almost spiritual sense of relief and gratitude experienced on those exceedingly rare, almost mythical occasions when a few hours of deep, largely uninterrupted sleep was somehow achieved. Perhaps this occurred in a secure, well-established permanent fort, after a long period of relative quiet on the frontier, or simply when sheer, utter, bone-crushing exhaustion so completely overwhelmed every other sensation, every ache, every fear, that oblivion was the only possible, inevitable outcome. Waking from such a sleep, even to the familiar depressing misery of another legionary day, felt like a brief, magical resurrection, a tiny, precious reset button for the mind and body before the relentless grind recommenced. These fleeting moments of genuine rest were hoarded in memory like precious jewels, oases of blessed unconsciousness in an otherwise vast and desolate desert of weary, nerve-shredding vigilance. Our man Gaius, bless his hobnailed socks, has sacrificed his comfort, his youth, his health, his peace of mind, and quite possibly his immortal soul for the greater glory, expansion, and security of the Roman Empire. He has endured hardships that would make a Stoic philosopher weep into his beard. So surely for all this unwavering dedication and truly monumental suffering in the name of Romanitas, he was at least rolling in freshly minted sestertii. Was he amassing a small fortune, carefully stashed away in his pack, to retire to a pleasant little villa in Campania with a sun-drenched vineyard, a few well-behaved slaves, and a suspiciously compliant local serving wench? Let's just say that his personal financial advisor, had he possessed such an outlandish and improbable luxury as a financial advisor, would have likely wept bitter tears into his abacus on a daily basis, and then probably charged him a hefty consultation fee for the privilege. The concept of a regular, predictable payday, involving a satisfying, weighty clinking of actual silver denarii being pressed into his calloused palm was, for Gaius on active, arduous campaign, often a delightful, almost mythical fiction, or at least a frequently and indefinitely postponed one. Legionaries were, in theory, entitled to a stipendium, an annual salary, which on paper, especially after a modest but welcome raise by Emperor Domitian in the late 1st century AD, from 225 to 300 denarii per year, might not have sounded entirely terrible to a lad from a dirt-poor farm who had previously considered a single bronze as to be a significant sum. 300 denarii a year. Why, that was almost enough to buy a decent donkey. However, the Roman military, with its centuries of experience in managing large numbers of men and even larger budgets, was an early and enthusiastic pioneer in the dark art of the aggressive, often bewildering, and entirely unavoidable deduction. From this theoretically princely sum, substantial amounts were automatically and often invisibly subtracted before Gaius ever saw a single coin. First and foremost, There were deductions for his food. Yes, that delightful previously detailed culinary tour of despair we discussed earlier wasn't exactly complimentary. He paid for the privilege of eating gritty hardtack and rancid bacon. More deductions followed for his clothing, his tunics, his cloak, and especially his boots, the infamous caligae, which wore out with depressing, almost planned, regularity on the punishing Roman roads and needed frequent, expensive replacement. Further deductions were made for the replacement of lost or damaged articles of his personal equipment, because of course things inevitably broke, rusted, or mysteriously vanished in the chaos of campaigning, and it was always deemed the soldier's fault. Then there were the compulsory contributions to the Legionary Burial Fund, administered by the Collegium, a grim but necessary provision ensuring that if, or more realistically when, he met his end, his comrades would at least give him a basic cremation and save his bones from being entirely scattered by wolves. A cheerful daily reminder of his likely occupational outcome. Finally, there might also be voluntary, but strongly encouraged contributions to the Legion's informal savings bank, often managed and sometimes mismanaged by the standard bearers, signiferi, of each century, who were responsible for the unit's payroll and finances. While this was generally a sensible idea for a soldier with no other way to secure his meager earnings, it further reduced his actual take-home pay, his walking around money, to practically nil for vast stretches of his service. After the various scribai and bean counters in the legionary administration, themselves often soldiers seconded to clerical duties, had meticulously or creatively tallied up all these deductions, the actual cash that Gaius might see, perhaps 3 times a year if he was lucky, and the pay chests actually arrived from Rome, could be pitifully, insultingly small, and often, especially during long, difficult campaigns in remote areas like Britannia, pay was significantly in arrears, sometimes for months or even years, leading to simmering discontent and the occasional, very risky mutiny. A denarius, the standard silver coin, was notionally a day's pay for a skilled laborer. But for Gaius, it was a theoretical concept more often than a jingle in his purse. He mostly dealt in small bronze fractions if he had any cash at all. With a few asses, he might buy a little extra wine from a camp follower, a piece of fruit, or gamble it away. His wages, therefore, more often arrived not in the form of clinking coin, but in the tangible, if unappetizing form of his daily issued rations. That precisely measured scoop of grain, that lump of salty, stringy bacon, that splash of acidic posca. This wasn't exactly a king's ransom designed to attract the best and brightest. It was calculated with chilling actuarial precision by Roman logisticians to be just about enough, and no more, to keep him physically functioning, to keep him marching, digging and fighting, without him inconveniently dying of starvation or malnutrition before the enemy had a decent chance to kill him instead. And deductions. Oh, the creative accounting that could occur if supplies were deemed damaged in transit, perhaps by a storm at sea or by a particularly enterprising quartermaster looking to supplement his own income by selling surplus on the black market. Suddenly, your already meager pay was docked even further for circumstances entirely, demonstrably beyond your individual control. It was a system designed to keep the soldier alive, but certainly not to make him wealthy, or even comfortable. However, even in this bleak economic landscape, a faint glimmer of positivity could occasionally be discerned, if one squinted hard enough. In a world of widespread precarious subsistence for many civilians, where famine, drought, or plague could wipe out a peasant family's livelihood overnight, the Roman army did offer a degree of grim baseline economic stability. That ration, however unpalatable and monotonous, usually appeared day in, day out. The pay, however small, however delayed, however riddled with deductions, was, at least in principle, owed and usually eventually paid. This was significantly more certainty than many of his civilian contemporaries could ever hope for. Furthermore, on rare, glorious, and eagerly anticipated occasions, an emperor, upon his accession to the throne, to celebrate a major military victory, to mark a significant anniversary, or sometimes just to keep the potentially mutinous legions loyal and sweet, might grant a donativum, a special bonus payment to every soldier. These lump sums could be very significant, sometimes amounting to several years' basic pay in one go. Such a windfall was cause for wild celebration, a sudden, intoxicating deluge of disposable income that might allow a legionary to actually save a meaningful sum, send a little money home to his impoverished family, if he could find a reliable way to do so, or simply enjoy a brief, glorious period of reckless, irresponsible spending if stationed near a civilian settlement with willing vendors of wine, women, and other fleeting pleasures. And then, of course, there was the ever-present illicit allure of plunder. While officially, sanctioned plunder from a sacked city or a defeated enemy camp was supposed to go to the state treasury or be distributed by the commanding general, with the lion's share invariably going to the officers. The chaos and confusion of a battlefield aftermath or a stormed town sometimes offered unofficial opportunities. A hidden stash of coins, a piece of discarded jewelry, a fine cloak, a usable weapon. These were high-risk, high-reward moments, but the dream of striking it lucky, of finding that one life-changing treasure, was a potent, if often entirely illusory motivator that kept many a legionary's eyes peeled amidst the carnage. There was a grand, almost tragic cosmic irony to Gaius's personal economic situation when contrasted with his role in the wider imperial economy. He, and tens of thousands of his muddy, calloused, underpaid comrades were the literal boots on the ground, the sharpened, bloodied edge of Roman foreign policy and economic expansion. They were the lifeblood of the empire's growth, the guarantors of its increasingly far-flung trade routes, the often brutal protectors of its ever-expanding frontiers. They marched across entire continents, conquered kingdoms that had stood for centuries, built roads, bridges, aqueducts, and forts that would endure for millennia, many of which still stand today as silent monuments to their toil. They transported, guarded, and protected the vast material wealth that flowed in an ever-increasing torrent into the insatiable maw of Rome and the pockets of its elite, and for this absolutely pivotal, utterly essential role in the grand, globe-spanning imperial project, Gaius, the individual legionary, was rewarded with a social status that hovered somewhere between that of a moderately useful, if occasionally troublesome farm animal, and a particularly stubborn, uncooperative patch of dirt. His actual monetary compensation, as we've seen, was a pittance, a tiny, almost insulting fraction of the colossal wealth he helped to generate and secure for others. He moved veritable mountains of wealth across the empire, yet his own worn leather purse, if he even possessed such a thing, would typically have contained nothing more than a few battered, low-value bronze coins, a collection of useless pebbles he thought might be lucky, and perhaps a generous helping of lint and shattered dreams. The disconnect between the immense strategic and economic importance of the legions as an institution and the personal economic reality of the individual legionary who made it all possible was staggering, a gulf as wide and deep as the Mediterranean. He was essential, yet he was treated as essentially worthless in the grand, impersonal scheme of imperial accounting, his value measured only by his current fighting fitness and his eventual replacement cost. He was building an empire of gold on a foundation of his own sweat and blood, and seeing precious little of the gold himself. Gaius's already precarious and unrewarding financial existence was further buffeted and battered by the unpredictable whims of gods, nature, and, most terrifyingly and frequently, his own rulers and the vast, impersonal bureaucracy of the Roman state. A series of devastatingly bad harvests across the empire due to drought or blight. That meant the price of grain, his staple food, went up, and suddenly his fixed ration deductions might take an even bigger, more painful bite out of his already meager pay, or more likely, the quality and quantity of the rations themselves would plummet, leading to increased hunger and discontent. A new ambitious emperor seizing the throne with grand designs for, say, invading a large, misty, and reportedly rather unpleasant island off the northern coast of Gaul. Hello, Britannia? That meant an insatiable, immediate hunger for more manpower, more ships, more weapons, more supplies, more everything. Pay for existing legions might be delayed, frozen, or even temporarily forgotten, as all available funds were diverted to finance the new, glorious, and incredibly expensive military adventure. Taxes might be increased back in his home province, meaning any tiny pittance he managed to save and somehow send to his struggling family, if he still had one and could find a trustworthy merchant or official to carry it, bought even less than it did before. Then there were the grand imperial building projects that so delighted the populace of Rome and immortalized the names of emperors. A new colossal aqueduct to bring fresh water to the capital, a magnificent new public bath complex, a vast marble-clad palace for the emperor and his bloated retinue. Wonderful for the citizens of Rome, no doubt. But these vast expenditures of public funds could, and often did, mean leaner, harder times for the legions shivering on the distant frontiers. War itself, while offering that slim, tantalizing chance of donatives or plunder, was, at its core, a massive, unrelenting drain on the imperial treasury. If a campaign dragged on inconclusively for years, as the numerous attempts to fully pacify the fiercely resistant tribes of Britannia certainly did, the logistical strain could become immense and unsustainable. Supplies of food, clothing, and equipment might dwindle or fail to arrive altogether. Pay would almost certainly be delayed, and the legionaries on the ground would simply be expected to make do, which in practice usually meant suffering more, foraging more desperately, and often more brutally, and generally enduring an even greater level of deprivation, all for less reward. Sometimes, an emperor facing a financial crisis might resort to debasing the currency, reducing the silver content of the denarius to meet his expenses. This meant that the coins Gaius eventually received for his service bought significantly less than they did before, a hidden pay cut that hit the lowest ranks hardest. It was a constant, wearying battle against vast, impersonal economic forces far beyond his control or comprehension. A game in which his personal economic well-being and that of his comrades was almost invariably the very last and least important consideration. The one significant, tangible, long-term economic prospect that gleamed like a distant, beckoning lighthouse in the stormy sea of his daily miseries, the hope that kept many a legionary like Gaius slogging through those 25 brutal, soul-destroying years of service, was the promise of the premium militia, the coveted discharge bonus. After a quarter of a century, or sometimes even longer if an emperor conveniently forgot to discharge time-served veterans during a protracted war, of loyal, back-breaking, terrifyingly life-threatening service, he was, by Roman law, entitled to a substantial lump sum of money, typically around 3,000 denarii in the early empire, later increased, equivalent to 10 or more years' basic pay. Or, alternatively, a plot of good arable land, often in a newly established veteran colony, perhaps even in the very province he had spent half his life fighting to conquer and hold, like Camulodunum, Colchester, or Lindum, Lincoln, in Britannia. This was the light at the end of a very long, very dark, very muddy, and very bloody tunnel. The thought of that final payday, the prospect of actually owning something tangible, something that couldn't be easily taken away, the chance to perhaps settle down, marry, officially as soldiers were often forbidden to legally marry while serving, raise a family, and not have to march another cursed, agonizing mile, was an incredibly powerful incentive, a dream that fueled endurance through unimaginable hardship. It was the Roman state's clever way of ensuring a steady supply of long-suffering recruits willing to trade their youth and health for a chance at a secure, if modest, old age, and also an effective method of populating and Romanizing newly conquered frontier territories with loyal, experienced, and heavily armed veterans. For Gaius, this dream was the fragile hope that made the daily, grinding economic nightmare of legionary service just about, almost, bearable. So Gaius has endured the Alps, a frozen hell that would make Dante reconsider his infernal geography. He has slogged his way through the endless forests and bogs of Gaul, acquiring new varieties of mud and insect life. And finally, after a delightful, vomit-inducing sea crossing on some overcrowded, leaky transport ship, he has set his hobnailed caligay on the damp, unwelcoming, and frequently hostile soil of Britannia. Objective achieved. Campaign over. Time to pack up the eagles. Head home for a triumph. Tea and medals. Right? Oh, you sweet, naive summer child. For a Roman legionary, particularly one involved in the generations-long, bloody and frustratingly incomplete project of pacifying an entire island full of rather peeved, woad-painted locals who stubbornly refuse to appreciate the benefits of Roman civilization, like taxes and crucifixion, one endless journey, simply transitioned seamlessly, and with no discernible improvement in conditions, into the next phase of an even more endless, soul-crushing cycle. The concept of finishing for the day was, as we've painstakingly established, a quaint, almost mythical notion, usually interrupted by the urgent need to construct a small, heavily fortified city before bedtime, often in the pouring rain, and with disturbingly fresh barbarian war cries echoing from the nearby woods. But finishing a campaign? That was an even more elusive, almost chimerical beast. Conquering the Alps, that monumental feat of endurance and engineering? That was merely the arduous, life-threatening commute to the actual place of work. Invading Britannia? That was simply the violent, messy opening act of a very long, very bloody, and often deeply unrewarding drama that would span decades, even centuries. Gaius, and thousands like him, would spend months, which would bleed into years, marching from one dreary, rain-swept, fog-bound corner of that accursed island to another. They'd engage in brutal, messy, inconclusive skirmishes in dense forests against elusive tribes like the Silures in Wales, who fought with a ferocity born of desperation. They'd chase shadowy Caledonian warriors through the bleak, heather-covered highlands of the north, a landscape designed by a vindictive god to break ankles and spirits. They'd burn a few isolated villages, whose inhabitants had usually sensibly vanished into the wilderness long before the legions arrived, capture a handful of scrawny cattle, and then, to consolidate these gains, they'd build yet another identical, drafty, uncomfortable fort to glare menacingly at the sullen, resentful survivors. And then, almost immediately, before the mud on their newly constructed ramparts had even had a chance to dry, they'd be ordered to march 50, 100, 200 miles in another direction, perhaps south, to deal with a fresh pocket of unrest amongst the Brigantes, or east to counter a coastal raid by opportunistic pirates. Unrest, of course, was the standard Roman military euphemism for people who quite reasonably and vigorously objected to being invaded, conquered, taxed into oblivion, and generally bossed around by heavily armed, arrogant foreigners who smelled faintly of garlic and stale discipline. The to-do list for a legionary in Britannia wasn't a structured, logical set of achievable objectives leading to a defined and satisfying victory. It was more like trying to stamp out individual embers in a vast, smoldering peat bog during a high wind. You furiously quell one tiny flare-up, and two more, larger and angrier, immediately ignite nearby. The road, or more often, the muddy, rutted track that Rome dignified with the name Via, flowed in countless bewildering directions across the hostile, unfamiliar landscape, and so, conveniently and miserably, did Gaius's seemingly endless toil. One newly constructed fort, built with months of back-breaking labor, simply meant a new, vulnerable frontier to patrol day and night in all weathers. One hard-fought battle won, with its attendant cost in blood, sweat, and terror, simply meant new, resentful territory to garrison, new sullen populations to Romanize, usually at the sharp end of a spear, or through the imposition of crippling taxes, and new opportunities for local resistance to fester and erupt. The work was never, ever truly done. It was a relentless, grinding, Sisyphean continuum of marching, digging, patrolling, skirmishing, building, rebuilding, and enduring, stretching out towards a misty, uncertain horizon that never, ever seemed to get any closer, no matter how many painful miles they covered. Even in those rare, blessed periods of so-called peaceful garrison duty in a relatively secure, established fortress, the cycle of thankless labor continued. Endless, monotonous patrols along windswept walls or through sodden forests. Endless, repetitive training drills, as if the daily reality of their existence wasn't educational enough in the arts of suffering and survival. Endless, frustrating repairs to the fort walls, which, thanks to the generous Britannic rainfall, were constantly trying to sag, erode, and collapse back into the primeval mud from whence they came. And the endless, simmering, underlying tension of being an occupying force in a land that fundamentally, deeply, and often violently hated your guts. The psychological wear of never truly finishing a job, of knowing that every task completed only led to another, equally arduous one, was immense. Gaius was trapped, plain, simple, and comprehensively. He'd sworn the sacramentum, the sacred military oath, usually in a public, highly ritualized ceremony, calling upon Jupiter and all the gods of Rome to witness his vow of absolute allegiance to the emperor and the sacred standards of his legion. He had sworn to obey his commanders without question or hesitation, to endure all hardships and not to desert his post, even unto death, for a period of 25 agonizingly long years. 25 years. To a young man of 18 or 20, recently plucked from a small village where time was measured by the seasons and the next harvest, that was a span of time so vast, so incomprehensibly immense, it was practically an abstract concept, an eternity. Desertion, of course, was technically an option, if you fancied being hunted down like a wild animal by specially designated bounty hunters, or your own former comrades, who often received a reward for your capture, dead or alive, then brutally flogged to within an inch of your miserable life, publicly shamed, and then as a final agonizing object lesson to others, crucified by the roadside, left to die slowly from exposure, dehydration, and the attentions of carrion birds. Not, on balance, an appealing career move. He was a tiny, insignificant cog in Rome's great, implacable, ever-grinding military machine. And that machine, fueled by imperial ambition and bureaucratic indifference, only stopped when it either broke you completely or when your quarter-century of indentured high-risk servitude was finally, mercifully, blessedly, up. The religious weight of the oath, with its invocation of divine retribution for failure, added another layer of psychological chains, making the thought of escape almost as terrifying as the reality of continued service. And for a soldier stationed in distant, isolated Britannia, at the very edge of the known world, as Tacitus called it, surrounded by hostile tribes and a cold, gray ocean, the physical possibilities of escape were almost as remote as the chances of a snowball surviving in Vulcan's forge. His life, his very existence, was tethered to the grand, indifferent, and often entirely capricious rhythms of imperial policy, the shifting tides of Roman politics, and the personal career ambitions of a succession of provincial governors and legionary legates he'd likely never meet, let alone understand. A new governor of Britannia, arriving fresh from the perfumed intrigues of Rome, might decide to make his mark and curry favor with the emperor by launching a glorious, and usually ill-advised, new offensive into the unconquered mountainous north, into the terrifying misty wilderness of Caledonia. And suddenly, without warning or consultation, Gaius and his weary mates were packing their sarcinae yet again, checking the edges on their gladi, and preparing for another grueling, spirit-sapping trek into unknown, hostile territory to fight different, even angrier, blue-painted men in slightly different, but equally miserable, weather conditions. You went where you were told. You did what you were ordered. You killed who you were commanded to kill. And you prayed to whatever motley collection of local and imported gods you still bothered with, that you'd somehow manage to see the next cold gray Britannic sunrise. He was a tiny, insignificant particle in the bloodstream of the Empire, flowing inexorably, unthinkingly, towards the next point of conflict, the next construction project, the next pointless display of Roman might, with absolutely no say in the direction of travel or the ultimate destination. And yet, even within this relentless, dehumanizing, and often terrifying cycle of seemingly pointless endeavor, there were perhaps, on very rare occasions, moments but of a certain dark, profound, almost visceral awe. To stand, exhausted but alive, on a newly constructed rampart of a freshly minted Roman fort, looking out over a wild, alien, incredibly hostile landscape that his own hands, and the hands of his comrades, had helped to tame, however temporarily, however brutally. To participate in a perfectly executed, devastatingly effective tactical maneuver that routed a numerically superior and terrifyingly loud barbarian force. To ford a raging, ice-cold river that seemed determined to sweep them all away, or to bridge a deep, precipitous chasm through sheer, audacious engineering skill, brute force, and an almost lunatic determination. These were undeniably testaments to what they, collectively as a legion, could achieve. There was a stark, brutalist artistry to it all, a visceral sense of imposing Roman will, Roman order, Roman geometry upon a chaotic, untamed, and deeply resentful world. It wasn't happiness, not by any stretch of a sane imagination, but it was a powerful, almost intoxicating affirmation of collective capability, of belonging, however unwillingly, to something immense, powerful, and historically significant, however terrible and morally dubious its methods might appear to later, more sensitive generations. The sheer, breathtaking, almost insane audacity of Roman ambition was a kind of terrible, awe-inspiring grandeur, and Gaius, our weary, mud-stained, flea-bitten legionary, was an unwilling but undeniably integral part of that grand, terrible historical pageant. He might even, in a rare moment of philosophical reflection, perhaps induced by a particularly strong batch of Posca or a near-death experience, have felt a fleeting, quickly suppressed flicker of this, a dizzying sense of being a tiny, dirty, utterly exhausted, yet somehow significant, piece of something historically monumental. Or perhaps he just thought about when his next meal was due. It would be a profound insult to the depth of his suffering to suggest that Gaius's life, caught as he was in this endless, grinding military meat grinder, contained anything even remotely approaching joy, in the modern, comfortable sense of the word. His daily, hourly existence was too harsh, too precarious, too deeply, intimately steeped in physical pain, mental anguish, and existential dread for such delicate, nuanced emotions. Yet even in the deepest, darkest, most fetid pit of daily misery, the human spirit can sometimes find the tiniest, most improbable, almost invisible crack of light, or at least a slightly less oppressive, less soul-destroying patch of shadow. There might be a grim, almost savage flicker of professional pride when he and his contubernalis, working with the desperate, synchronized efficiency born of long practice and shared terror, managed to erect their allotted section of the nightly camp wall, faster, more solidly, and with straighter stakes than the neighboring, less competent tent group, perhaps even earning a rare, almost imperceptible grunt of something that might have been approval from the ever-watchful, ever-critical centurion. There was the essential release of black humor, shared in hushed, bitter tones over a miserable, smoky meal of burnt porridge and existential regret. Jokes so dark, so cynical, so utterly tasteless, they would make a hardened vulture reconsider its lunch choices and possibly seek therapy. Sometimes, an entirely unexpected, unlooked-for act of kindness from a fellow legionary could feel like a veritable banquet of human warmth in a desolate wasteland of indifference. The simple, profound, almost euphoric relief of surviving a chaotic, terrifying skirmish completely unscathed, while men all around you screamed, fell, and died, was a potent, if deeply selfish and guilt-tinged affirmation of your own continued, improbable existence, or even the fleeting, accidental, almost shocking beauty of a sunrise over a mist-covered Britannic valley, the sky painted in impossible hues of orange, pink, and gold, observed from a cold, lonely sentry post on the ramparts of some forgotten fort. A brief, breathtaking moment of stillness, silence, and unexpected wonder before the brutal, noisy, ugly business of another Roman military day began. These weren't rewards. They weren't pleasures. They certainly weren't luxuries. They were momentary, almost accidental stays of execution for the soul. Tiny, fragile reminders that even in the iron heart of the imperial war machine, battered, bruised, and deeply buried scraps of common humanity, or at least instinctive human reaction to beauty and kindness, could still, miraculously, be found. Years, laden with endless marches, countless nights on cold ground, the gnawing ache of old wounds, and the slow accretion of bitter memories have ground relentlessly by. Seasons have turned from the deceptive, fleeting warmth of a Britannic summer to the bone-chilling, soul-sapping damp of its endless winters. Campaigns have been fought, sometimes won with great slaughter, sometimes lost with ignominy, but more often they have simply fizzled out into a sullen, simmering, inconclusive stalemate on some remote, forgotten frontier. Our Gaius, once a fresh-faced, if understandably terrified Tiro recruit, his skin still relatively smooth, his eyes still holding a faint glimmer of youthful hope, or perhaps just naive bewilderment, is now a seasoned, gnarled, deeply cynical veteran. He's seen more rain than a Welsh duck in a monsoon, dug more defensive ditches than a legion of hyperactive badgers with a serious complex, and ingested more questionable, potentially lethal rations than should be legally permissible for one unfortunate human stomach. But the insatiable Roman military machine always needs fresh grist for its relentless mill. The river of recruits must ever flow to replace the fallen, the broken, and the time expired. Gaius didn't exactly choose this life of relentless hardship with enthusiastic, fully informed consent. And chances are, neither did the fresh batches of Tyrones who were periodically marched into the fort under armed guard, looking wide-eyed, bewildered, and reeking faintly of misplaced optimism, rural naivety, and often actual farm animal, as his own physical strength, while still likely formidable by civilian standards due to years of brutal conditioning, began its slow, inevitable, and deeply resented wane. He'd look at these youngsters, and a complex, bitter, almost unpalatable brew of emotions would churn in his gut. There was invariably a deep, weary, cynical amusement watching them struggle with the same impossibly heavy kit that had tormented him for what felt like several lifetimes. He'd see them fumbling with their shield discipline during drill, tripping over their own pila, looking utterly bewildered and terrified by the centurion's creative, often scatological insults, and generally making all the same mistakes he had made 2 decades prior. There was also, surprisingly, a profound, almost paternal, if he'd ever known a decent father, pity, knowing with absolute bone-deep certainty the crushing weight of brutal reality that was about to descend upon their naive, unsuspecting shoulders, extinguishing their youthful hopes like a hobnailed boot on a candle flame. And sometimes, very occasionally, when he wasn't feeling too misanthropic or too crippled by his aching joints, there was a flicker of something that might, in a very generous light, be interpreted as mentorship, not the warm, encouraging, nurturing kind you might read about in philosophical treatises. No, this was the harsh, pragmatic, brutally honest, and usually unsolicited advice of a man who's seen far too much, suffered far too much, and expects absolutely nothing but the worst from the army, from the barbarians, and from life in general. "Keep that helmet strapped tight, boy," he might rasp to a fumbling recruit, or your brains will be decorating some painted bastard's shield before you can say mea culpa. Or, learn to sleep standing up, leaning on your spear. It saves time, and the centurion might not notice you're dead to the world. Perhaps, don't ever trust a smiling quartermaster, especially if he tells you the meat is fresh. Or more darkly, learn to tell the difference between a centurion who's merely professionally angry and one who's looking to make a particularly memorable and painful example out of someone. It's a subtle distinction, but your skin will thank you for mastering it. He wouldn't say it kindly. He'd bark it, with a glare and a sneer, just as some equally grizzled, equally cynical veteran had barked similar warnings at him an age ago. And the recruit, trembling slightly, would look back with those wide, youthful, uncomprehending eyes, a mixture of fear, confusion, dawning despair, and the dreadful, slowly sinking understanding that this was his glorious, eagerly anticipated inheritance. Gaius wasn't just passing on a few cynical tips. He was witnessing with a kind of detached horror the relentless, pitiless perpetuation of his own agonizing ordeal. The flickering, guttering torch of misery being handed down to a new, unsuspecting generation, destined to fuel Rome's insatiable ambitions with their youth, their health, and their tragically short lives. Perhaps he'd see a younger version of himself in one of them, and feel a pang of something that might almost be regret, or just indigestion from the previous night's stew. If Gaius had, against all odds and regulations, formed some sort of semi-permanent liaison in the Canabae, that sprawling, chaotic, often squalid civilian settlement of traders, artisans, prostitutes, soldiers' unofficial wives, and their broods of half-Roman children that inevitably, organically, grew up like a parasitic fungus outside the stark, orderly walls of any long-term legionary fortress, and fathered a son, then the cycle of intergenerational suffering could be even more direct, more personal, more agonizing. That boy, the castrensis, child of the camp, growing up in the literal shadow of the eagle standards, knowing no other life, no other world, but the harsh rhythms and brutal realities of the military frontier, might well see enlistment in his father's legion as his only viable path, his only chance for status, security, or escape from the squalor of the settlement. Gaius would then experience the unique, exquisite agony of watching his own flesh and blood willingly, almost eagerly, shackle himself to the same leaking, overloaded, storm-tossed barge of a life that he himself had endured for so long, knowing with chilling prescience every ache, every fear, every humiliation, every bitter disappointment that lay in store for his boy. The settlements of the Canabae themselves were a microcosm of the empire, a vibrant, noisy, often dangerous mix of cultures, languages, and desperation, where fortunes could be made by canny merchants selling overpriced goods to soldiers, and lives could be lost in a drunken brawl over a spilled drink. For the children born there, the legion was often the only visible ladder out, or at least, a path to a different kind of structured hardship. Yet, as a grizzled, time-served veteran, perhaps even an immunis, a soldier excused certain menial duties due to a special skill, or a junior non-commissioned officer like a decurion if he had shown some aptitude and managed to avoid antagonizing too many superiors, Gaius also wielded a certain grim, understated authority amongst the ranks. He knew the ropes, the scams, the unwritten rules, the subtle ways to navigate the treacherous currents of legionary life. He knew which officers were best avoided, which quartermasters were most corrupt, which local water sources were least likely to give you a fatal dose of the flux, and which type of wood made the least smoke when you were trying to cook a stolen chicken without alerting the entire camp. Younger soldiers, those not entirely consumed by their own arrogance or stupidity, might grudgingly respect his hard-won experience, seeking him out in hushed tones for advice on how to survive not just the enemy in the field, but also the often more dangerous internal politics and arbitrary cruelties of the legion itself. There was a somber, almost reluctant satisfaction in this, perhaps. He was a survivor, a walking, talking, coughing, spitting testament to human endurance in the face of overwhelming odds. and in his own cynical, world-weary way, he could, if he chose, ease the path for those few new recruits who showed a flicker of intelligence and a willingness to listen, perhaps preventing them from making some of the more immediately lethal mistakes. He was part of the Legion's institutional memory, a walking, grumbling archive of hardship, loss, and hard-won, bitterly learned knowledge. This wasn't glory, this wasn't power, but it was a form of status, a rugged, battered dignity earned through decades of relentless attrition and sheer bloody-minded survival. But the Roman military machine, like any cruel, implacable moneylender, always collects its debts in the end, and the primary currency it demanded was Gaius's own flesh, blood, and bone. The chronic, nagging back pain that was once a dull, manageable ache, something he could almost ignore after a few cups of wine, was now a constant, fiery, debilitating torment that made even simple actions like bending to tie his sandals an agonizing ordeal. That old, poorly healed spear wound in his thigh, a painful souvenir from some forgotten, chaotic skirmish in a misty Britannic forest 20 years ago, now throbbed with a vicious, malevolent intensity whenever the damp weather set in, which, in Britannia, was most of the damn time. The arthritis in his hands, a direct result of decades of gripping cold iron and damp wood, had progressed to the point where his fingers were gnarled, swollen, and almost useless, making it an exercise in pure, teeth-gritting agony to grip his gladius effectively for morning drills, let alone for a life-or-death struggle. His once strong hands now fumbled with buckles and straps. His eyesight, once sharp enough to spot a lurking Silurian warrior at 100 paces in fading light, was now failing, the world dissolving into a frustrating, indistinct, and increasingly dangerous blur, making it hard to distinguish friend from foe at a distance, or even to read a crudely scrawled order posted on the Principia notice board. That persistent, hacking cough, born of countless nights spent sleeping on cold, wet ground and breathing in the acrid smoke of campfires, now rattled his chest like a sack of loose stones with every breath, often bringing up phlegm tinged with blood. He was, quite simply, wearing out. The younger men, the new generation of sufferers, lean, hard, and full of piss and vinegar, mostly vinegar from the Posca, would start to outpace him on the march, their movements quicker, their endurance seemingly limitless, just as his once had been. He'd see them vaulting obstacles he now had to climb over painfully and slowly. The centurion's gaze, which used to assess him for his fighting strength and reliability, would now pass over him with a new kind of cold, calculating assessment. The look of a man evaluating a worn-out, blunted tool, wondering how much genuinely useful service it had left before it needed to be discarded and replaced. It was a slow, painful, deeply humiliating realization of his own encroaching obsolescence, the dawning awareness that he was no longer an asset, but increasingly a liability. The fear of this, the fear of not making it to that all-important 25-year mark for honorable discharge and the full pension, was a new kind of cold dread that settled in his gut. There was no comfortable, state-sponsored retirement home with gentle nursing care for Roman legionaries whose bodies gave out before their full term of service was completed. If an injury sustained in battle, an accident during training or construction work, or a debilitating illness was severe enough to render him permanently unfit for active military service, inutilis, he might, if he was lucky and had a sympathetic commanding officer or a well-placed bribe, receive a medical discharge, a missio causaria. This came with a significantly smaller pension or land grant than the full onesta missio, and for some deeply institutionalized veterans, it carried the bitter stigma of not having completed their full term, a sort of professional failure, however unavoidable the circumstances. For many others, though, any escape from the daily grind, even a broken, impoverished one, was probably a welcome, if bittersweet, relief. More often, perhaps, a man simply faded away, dying of his accumulated ailments in some miserable frontier sickbay, his passing noted only by a clerk striking his name from the rolls. But if Gaius endured, if his battered, broken, disease-ridden body somehow, miraculously, held together for the full, interminable 25 years. Then came the day of days, the moment he had dreamed of, longed for and despaired of ever seeing, the honesta missio, the honorable discharge. This was the ultimate goal, the distant, glittering star that legionaries navigated by through the long, dark night of their service. He would, in a formal ceremony, receive his military diploma, a small, portable pair of inscribed bronze tablets, a tabula honestae missionis, legally verifying his long and honorable service and granting him, if he wasn't already a Roman citizen by birth, as many later legionaries were, the full rights and privileges of Roman citizenship for himself and, crucially, for his descendants. This was a hugely significant social and legal elevation, and perhaps even more importantly to a man who had known little but poverty and hardship, he'd receive his premium militia, the substantial discharge bonus, either a hefty lump sum of several thousand denarii, enough with careful management to buy a small farm, set up a modest business like a tavern or a workshop, or simply live out his remaining years in relative comfort, or alternatively, a designated plot of good arable land, often in a newly established veteran colony, perhaps even in Britannia itself. A final, poignant irony to be settling down as a farmer in the very land he'd spent half his adult life fighting to control and subdue. His body might be a complete wreck, a painful, walking patchwork of old scars, badly healed fractures, and chronic, debilitating pains. He might be old before his time, his face a leathered mask of hardship, his spirit weary to its very core. But he would be free, legally, tangibly, wonderfully free. Free from the endless mind-numbing marching, free from the arbitrary cruelty and bellowed commands of centurions, free from the ever-present gnawing fear of a sudden, violent death in some forgotten corner of a hostile land. He had survived. He had endured. And in the brutal, unforgiving calculus of Roman military life, survival with honor, citizenship, and a pension was the ultimate, almost unbelievable victory. He could now, perhaps, on his first day of freedom, find the nearest functioning bathhouse and soak his aching bones in hot water for hours. He could eat a meal, a proper meal with actual flavor, slowly, without fear of interruption or theft. He could, if he chose, simply sleep for an entire day, and no one would kick him awake. The future was uncertain, civilian life perhaps holding its own new challenges, but it was his future, to do with as he pleased. The relief would be immense, profound, almost dizzying, perhaps tinged with a strange sense of loss for the harsh camaraderie he was leaving behind, but overwhelmingly, it would be the sweet, sweet taste of improbable survival. So, what becomes of our Gaius in the grand, sweeping, indifferent narrative of history? Whether he died of dysentery in some forgotten, fly-blown marching camp in the wilds of Dacia, his body unceremoniously dumped in a shallow, unmarked grave, whether he fell under a barbarian axe during a chaotic ambush in a misty Britannic forest, his last sight the woad-painted, screaming face of his killer, or whether he actually miraculously lived long enough to grumble his way through a full 25-year enlistment and claim his precious discharge papers, his individual name, like those of countless millions of his comrades in arms across the centuries of Roman dominion, has long since been swallowed by the vast, echoing silence of history. No triumphal arches were raised for Miles Gregarious Gaius of the second cohort. No epic poems by Virgil or Horace celebrate his remarkable ability to endure truly appalling food for decades, or to dig a perfectly regulation latrine trench with heroic efficiency and minimal complaint. He is, for all intents and purposes, as an individual, utterly, comprehensively, and irretrievably forgotten. The grand tombs on the Appian Way were for senators and their wealthy wives, not for common soldiers whose only monument was the occasional, crudely carved, often misspelled tombstone erected by his grieving tentmates, if he was lucky. Emperors like Augustus, who boasted he found Rome a city of brick and left it one of marble. Trajan, whose column meticulously details his Dacian conquests, from the general's perspective, of course. Hadrian, who built walls to define and defend the empire's limits. Their names are carved in monumental stone. Their faces gaze out from countless surviving statues. Their deeds, often heavily embellished and carefully curated by historians in their pay, are recorded in the annals of history that students still dutifully study. We marvel at their surviving temples, their forums, their colossal amphitheaters, their intricate aqueducts that brought life-giving water to burgeoning cities. But beneath the shadow of every colossal, self-aggrandizing statue, under the meticulously laid foundations of every magnificent public building, supporting the very roads that stitched a vast and disparate empire together, lay the unrecorded, unacknowledged, and almost unimaginable sum of sweat, blood, toil, and tears shed by hundreds of thousands, indeed millions, of anonymous ordinary men like our Gaius. They were the literal groundwork, the human cement, the calloused, mud-stained hands that built the physical reality of the Roman world. He wore no laurel wreath, unless it was fashioned from sarcasm and despair, commanded no legions, beyond perhaps issuing gruff orders to a terrified new recruit on how to properly clean a cooking pot, and certainly never got to address the Senate unless he was being dragged before a military tribunal to be disciplined for some infraction, real or imagined. His daily pressing concerns were not geopolitical strategy, trade balances, or the intricacies of Roman law, but the immediate, visceral state of his hobnailed caligae, the dubious, potentially lethal contents of his next meager meal, the ever-present threat of the centurion's vine staff, and the chillingly damp spot in the tent, where the roof invariably leaked directly onto his sleeping head, yet without his relentless, monotonous, back-breaking toil, without his calloused, bleeding hands and his aching, overburdened back, the granaries that fed the teeming, restless population of Rome itself would have remained empty and dangerously volatile. The trade routes that brought the wealth of the known world to the imperial capital, the arteries of Roman commerce, would have been impassable, bandit-infested gauntlets. The mines that produced the silver for Roman coinage and the gold for senatorial jewelry, often worked by slave labor under military supervision, would have been unproductive. The agricultural estates that fed the legions and the cities, often established on newly conquered land, would have been overrun. And the armies that supposedly civilized the known world, that imposed the Pax Romana, a peace often bought at the price of horrific violence and subjugation, would have faltered, fragmented, and ultimately failed. He was the unseen, unthanked ant, one of a teeming, numberless colony, laboring tirelessly, often thanklessly, under a crushing burden, to build and maintain the glittering, imposing, and often terrifyingly brutal mountain of Roman civilization. The architects, the engineers, the generals, and the emperors got the credit, the statues, and the historical footnotes. Gaius and his comrades got the blisters, the dysentery, the shortened lifespans, and, if they were exceptionally unfortunate, a starring role in a barbarian's victory celebration. And yet, there's a profound, if often overlooked, and deeply ironic positive in this relentless, thankless anonymity. The very grandeur we still associate with Rome, its astonishing longevity as an empire, its almost unbelievable ability to project power, law, language, and culture across vast geographical and cultural distances, was not solely, or even primarily, the product of a few brilliant generals, visionary emperors, or silver-tongued orators in the Senate. It was built, quite literally, stone by painful stone, mile by weary mile, on the broad, scarred, and perpetually aching backs of these ordinary, expendable, intensely suffering men. Their endurance, their discipline, however brutally it was enforced, their sheer, grinding collective effort formed the unyielding bedrock of one of history's most influential and enduring empires. Their historical importance wasn't quiet because it was insignificant. It was quiet because it was so utterly pervasive, so absolutely fundamental to the entire Roman system, that it became as invisible and taken for granted as the air the senators breathed in their marble halls, until, of course, That bedrock began to crack and crumble in the later centuries, and the entire edifice began to shudder. No grand statues were raised in Gaius's specific individual honor. His name, if it was ever even crudely scratched onto a lead curse tablet thrown into a sacred spring, or perhaps onto a wooden writing tablet sent home from Vindolanda on Hadrian's wall, filled with mundane requests for more socks and complaints about the local beer, has long since dissolved into the dust, the mud, and the mists of forgotten frontiers. Yet his legacy, and that of his countless anonymous, hobnailed brothers in arms, is in a very real sense everywhere around us, hidden in plain sight, for those who have the eyes to see and the wit to understand. It's in the straight, uncompromising, almost arrow-like lines of Roman roads that still crisscross the landscapes of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, some of which, remarkably, still form the foundations of modern highways and country lanes. Roads that Gaius and his legionary comrades surveyed with rudimentary instruments, dug out of virgin wilderness by hand, paved with locally sourced stone, and then marched endlessly upon, under a punishing sun, or in freezing driving rain. It's in the crumbling, evocative ruins of countless Roman forts, signal stations, and fortified walls, from the windswept, desolate heights of Hadrian's Wall in northern Britannia, glaring defiantly towards the unconquered Caledonians, to the sun-baked desert edges of Syria and Palestine, guarding the eastern frontier. Fortifications meticulously planned, expertly engineered, and physically built by legionary hands, silent, brooding testaments to their incredible engineering skill, their discipline, and their often brutal role as the enforcers of infrequently unstable peace. It's even deeply embedded in the very languages we speak today. The vulgar Latin carried across Europe by unlettered, rough-tongued marching legions like Gaius's, mingling with local Celtic, Germanic, and Iberian tongues, became the fertile soil from which the modern Romance languages, French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, blossomed, and which profoundly, irrevocably influenced the development of English and German. The legal concepts they defended with their lives, the urban layouts of towns that first grew up as civilian settlements, canabae, huddled outside the protective walls of their permanent legionary fortresses, the very idea of a unified, interconnected European space, however imperfectly realized then or now, all these bear the faint, indelible, often blood-stained fingerprints of the common Roman legionary. They spread Roman material culture too, not just weapons but pottery styles, like Samian ware, building techniques, tools, even tastes in food and drink, carried in their packs and established in their veteran colonies. They didn't just passively witness history from the sidelines. They physically, brutally, laboriously moved it, shaped it with their sweat and blood, built its very infrastructure with their calloused hands, and defended its often arbitrary and violently imposed borders with their short, stabbing swords and their expendable lives. They were the anonymous, unstoppable current in the vast river of history, the motive force, the sheer human horsepower that allowed Roman civilization, for all its manifold flaws, its inherent brutalities, and its ultimate inevitable decline, to flow, to expand, and to flourish for so many centuries, leaving an indelible, inescapable imprint on the world that we still inhabit and grapple with today. The wine Gaius might have managed to cultivate on his small discharge plot in Gaul or Spain, the Latin phrases his children or grandchildren might have spoken, the relative, or more likely continued lack of, security of the frontier region he helped to pacify at such terrible personal cost. These were all tiny, almost invisible ripples spreading outwards from the heavy, blood-soaked stone of his long and arduous service. So the next time you read about the legendary martial glories of Rome, the next time you see a Hollywood epic depicting its disciplined, all-conquering legions, the next time you visit a museum and gaze upon a battered, rust-stained Roman helmet or a chipped piece of legionary pottery, or perhaps even walk along a quiet country lane that you now know follows the ghostly, unerring line of an ancient Roman road, spare a moment's thought for the forgotten anonymous Gaius. Him, and the literally millions like him, trudging wearily through the centuries in their uncomfortable hobnailed sandals, laden with crushing gear, their faces etched with hardship, their bodies scarred and broken, facing down unimaginable fear and almost unbelievable hardship, day after relentless day, year after thankless year. He sought no great lasting glory, beyond perhaps a mention in a triumph if his legion was particularly successful, an honor almost exclusively reserved for the commanding general, certainly not for a common grunt. And he received precious little reward in his lifetime, beyond his meager, often delayed pay, his frequently inadequate rations, and the distant, flickering, improbable promise of eventual survival. Yet in his unceasing, often mind-numbing labor, in his stubborn, almost superhuman endurance against conditions that would break most modern men in a matter of weeks, if not days, he was so much more than just a passive sufferer, more than a mere victim of imperial ambition and military necessity. He was a fundamental, essential, indispensable, if almost entirely unacknowledged, part of the great, unseen, smoke-belching engine that powered an entire civilization for half a millennium. He wasn't just an insignificant drop in the vast, turbulent river of history. He was, along with his countless equally forgotten comrades, its very current, its motive force, inexorably shaping its banks, relentlessly moving its silt, unknowingly carrying the seeds of the future world that was to come, a world that would be built upon the ruins, and also upon the enduring legacies of the empire he served so painfully. His individual name is lost, utterly and forever, to the uncaring winds that blow over the grass-covered ruins of Roman forts and the silent, plowed fields where ancient battles were once fought. But his collective contribution, the unimaginable sum total of all that unrecorded toil, that uncomplaining, mostly suffering, that unthanked sacrifice, is, in a very real sense, eternal. He was, in the truest sense, the weary wanderer of his age, who by the bitterest of ironies helped to lay the very foundations of much of the settled world we still inhabit today. And for that, if for nothing else, he deserves not our pity, nor our condemnation for the brutalities he was forced to enact, but a profound, if deeply somber, and long overdue respect. The Roman legionary, it profoundly, comprehensively, and inventively sucked to be him, but it profoundly, undeniably, and historically mattered that he was.